The agenda is adopted.
На основании правила 37 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании представителей Германии и Украины. Решение принимается. На основании правила 39 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании следующих докладчиков. Госпожу Розмари Ди Карло, заместителя генерального секретаря по политическим вопросам и вопросам миростроительства. Его превосходительство господина Мика Кинунина, специального представителя действующего председателя ОБСЕ на Украине и в трехсторонней контактной группе. Его превосходительство господина Яшара Халита Чевика, главного наблюдателя специальной мониторинговой миссии ОБСЕ на Украине, и госпожу Татьяну Монтян, украинскую активистку гражданского общества. Решение принимается. Сейчас Совет Безопасности приступит к рассмотрению пункта 2 повестки дня. И сейчас представляю слово госпоже Розмари Ди Карло.
Thank you, Mr. President. I last briefed this Council on the situation in Ukraine as it relates to the implementation of the Minsk agreements on 11 February 2021. At that time, I drew attention to the fragile security situation that prevailed despite the nominal ceasefire in place. Today, a year since that briefing, tensions in and around Ukraine are running higher than at any point since 2014. Speculation and accusations around a potential military conflict are rife. Whatever one believes about the prospect of such a confrontation, the reality is that the current situation is extremely dangerous. The issues underpinning the current crisis are complex and long-standing. They tie together the 8-year conflict in eastern Ukraine with the larger issues related to European security architecture. Although seemingly intractable, given the stakes involved for our collective security and European stability, these issues can and must be solved through diplomacy in the full use of the many available regional and other mechanisms and frameworks. We support all such efforts, including through the Secretary General's good offices. Mr. President, regrettably, there's been little, if any, meaningful progress in the implementation of the various provisions of the Minsk agreements. Despite repeated efforts, the talks both in the number 4 format and the discussions led by the Trilateral Contact Group remain deadlocked. We welcome the efforts of France and Germany to host the recent N4 discussions to break the current impasse and hope that these will continue. The Minsk agreements remain the only framework endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2202 for a negotiated peaceful settlement of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. In this regard, we note with concern the reports of fresh ceasefire violations across the contact line over the past several hours. If verified, these violations must not be allowed to escalate further. We call on all sides to exercise maximum restraint at this time. We also call on all concerned to refrain from any unilateral measures that may go against the letter and spirit of the Minsk agreements or undermine their implementation and result in further tensions, including related to the status of certain areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. We commend the important work of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The Council will hear shortly from Ambassador Mikko Kinnunen, Special Representative of the OSCE's Chairperson in Office in Ukraine, and Ambassador Khalid Chevik, Chief Monitor of the OSCE's Special Monitoring Mission. It's essential that we support their work, particularly at this critical time. The Special Monitoring Mission, which carries out its crucial functions despite considerable challenges, must enjoy safe and secure conditions. Mr. President, on 14 February, the Secretary General expressed his deep worry regarding a potential military conflict in Europe. he reminded the international community that the price in human suffering, destruction, and damage to European and global security is too high to contemplate. The Secretary General has remained fully engaged with key actors, including the governments of the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and has reiterated the same unambiguous message. There is no alternative to diplomacy. It's incumbent on all member states to fully respect the key principles of the United Nations Charter, to settle disputes by peaceful means, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. In this regard, let me restate the commitment of the United Nations to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, as called for in GA resolutions. The recent diplomatic contacts, including between heads of state, are welcome. But more needs to be done urgently, including tangible steps on the ground and an end to inflammatory rhetoric to diffuse tensions. Mr. President, as we have done throughout the 8 years of the conflict, the United Nations continues to stand with the people of Ukraine. The UN country team in Ukraine remains fully operational. Our humanitarian colleagues are committed to providing assistance in accordance with the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity, and independence. This includes, for example, 3 humanitarian convoys that delivered over 140 metric tons of life-saving assistance across the contact line since the start of 2022, benefiting thousands of people in need. It's imperative that safe and unimpeded access by humanitarian actors is respected by all sides under any circumstances. Amid the current tensions, we should not lose sight of the existing dire humanitarian needs impacting 2.9 million people, with the majority living in non-government controlled areas of eastern Ukraine. Donor support has allowed us to provide aid to over 1.5 million people during the first 9 months of 2021, the highest level since 2017. This critical achievement must be sustained amid the increasing severity of humanitarian needs. Early and adequate funding of the $190 million 2022 Humanitarian Response Plan is needed to continue to meet the urgent needs of 1.8 million vulnerable people, including over 1 million in government-controlled areas and 750,000 in non-government controlled areas. Mr. President, for the war-weary people of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, the impact of COVID-19 on top of the conflict has caused even more grave disruption and suffering. Millions of people who prior to the pandemic could still maintain family and community connectivity have been unable to travel freely across the contact line due to COVID-19 related restrictions. As a consequence of their increased isolation and abrupt loss of access to basic services and livelihoods, the needs of this already vulnerable population have been exacerbated. At the same time, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights continues to document civilian casualties and the impact of hostilities, monitor freedom of movement, and receive and report on allegations of human rights violations. Despite the persistent tensions, last year saw the lowest number of civilian casualties documented by OHCHR since the beginning of the conflict. Overall adherence to the ceasefire has been an important factor in this trend. It must continue. Mr. President, over 14,000 people have already lost their lives in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. As the Secretary General said this week, we simply cannot accept even the possibility of a new conflict in Ukraine. Indeed, we are facing a test. The world is looking to the collective security mechanisms in Europe, but also to this Council to help ease tensions and ensure that the only skirmishes will be diplomatic. We cannot afford to fail. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю
I think
госпожу Розмари
Ms.
Ди Карло за ее
Rosemary
брифинг.
DiCarlo for her briefing.
И сейчас предоставляю
now
слово
give the floor
его
to His
превосходительству
Excellency,
господину Мика
Mr.
Кинунину.
Mikko Kinnunen.
The TCG supports implementation of the settlement provided by the Minsk agreements. However, in times like these, it is impossible to address the Donbas issue without paying attention to the bigger context, which is the tense security situation around Ukraine and in the region, as well as the intensive high-level diplomacy. Arguably, this bigger context has a strong interlinkage with the work of the Trilateral Contact Group. This argument is based on views according to which finding a solution to the main task of the TCG, implementation of the Minsk agreements, could help in solving many of the issues of the bigger picture. However, presently, positions of the participants to the discussions of the TCG are too far from each other. Consequently, as of now, it is not yet possible to solve the conflict related to Eastern Ukraine within the TCG. We need to continue our work. At the same time, it is important to note that all the elements of the three Minsk agreements are relevant and need to be addressed. These agreements, Minsk Protocol, Minsk Memorandum, and the Minsk package of measures continue to form the basis of our work. It is crucial that all sides will continue to remain committed. It is popular to accuse one or another participant to the discussions for violating Minsk agreements or for not wanting to implement Minsk agreements. Here, my message would suggest caution. The fact is that none of the elements of the Minsk agreements has been implemented, or at least fully implemented. Furthermore, in my experience, it is not possible nor appropriate to single out only one party for being responsible for this. Everyone involved in the discussions of the Trilateral Contact Group needs to bear their responsibility for carrying out what has been agreed. We need more flexible positions and readiness to compromise. Mr. President, security situation along the 480 kilometers long contact line that separates government-controlled area from the non-government-controlled area of Eastern Ukraine is one of the key focuses of the work of the TCG. In the present situation, particularly with reference to the bigger contexts, it is important to continue to stay calm also along the contact line. Provocations are to be avoided. At the end of the day, no one would benefit from new military activities. Concrete press example of a potentially provocative situation is the alleged shelling that occurred this morning in Luhansk region, close to the contact line. It is important to try to establish facts in a swift manner and to avoid escalation. One participant to the discussions of the TCG has requested for an extraordinary TCG meeting. Armed conflict related to Eastern Ukraine is 8 years old, as referred by the Undersecretary General. The conflict continues, has resulted in over 14,000 victims, hundreds of thousands of IDPs and refugees. Crossings over the contact line have dropped, civilian crossings, by 95% since the closing of checkpoints 2 years ago, resulting in additional civilian suffering and hardship. Conflict-affected areas with ongoing military activities have sadly become part of everyday life for countless Ukrainian citizens. In late December 2021, 2 months ago, participants to the discussions of the trilateral contact group agreed fully to adhere to the ceasefire agreement of July 2020. This New Year's commitment 2 months ago did not hold well enough. However, the positive side of the matter was, for 1 month period following the commitment, there were 70% less ceasefire violations than during the month before. This once again indicates if there is political will, it is possible not to use arms, possible not to fire. True, there have been small positive steps with our work, such as creation of an environmental expert group. Recent IAEA visit to the non-government controlled area shows that when there is will on all sides, agreeing is possible. But clearly, not enough progress has been made. One reason to this are status-related issues that may, from the outside, appear procedural, but are actually part of the core substance. Mr. President, Excellencies, during this week, the State Duma of the Russian Federation approved a resolution calling upon the Russian president to recognize independence of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This has caused questions and internal discussion within the TCG. While I know that the Duma resolution does not reflect the official line of the government, it is important to emphasize that all participants need to remain committed to the goal of restoring Ukraine's sovereignty over the totality of its territory. At the same time, the big context, the bigger picture, the unprecedented international focus on Ukraine and the region should be used as an opportunity to intensify, to unblock the work of the TCG. I am grateful for the recent high-level contacts between the leaders of the Normandy 4, as well as the 2 meetings of the Normandy 4 political advisors, and, for example, of the OSCE chairman in office discussions in Kiev and Moscow during the past days. These all could give new impetus to unblock TCG's work. They could, for example, to give us an opportunity to have and focus, to have substantial discussions on certain concrete draft laws at the very heart of the Minsk agreements. Finally, TCG has now met in video format in online meetings almost for 2 years. Meetings in video format lack drive and confidentiality. For several reasons, they do not offer possibilities for genuine negotiations and interaction. My goal remains to return to face-to-face meetings of our unique platform that does bring together Ukraine, Russia, the OSCE, as well as representatives of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Кинунина за его брифинг. И сейчас я представляю слово его превосходительству господину Яшару Халиду Чевику.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to brief this council today. In my capacity as the chief monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine and as the coordinator of the working group on security issues in the trilateral group, I will update you on key developments on the situation in eastern Ukraine during the past year. These include the security situation along the contact line, the impact of nearly 8 years of the conflict on civilians, and the SMM's increasingly challenging operational environment. The security situation remains fraught with tension. The gradual frame of the ceasefire I described to the Council last February has regrettably accelerated, and inevitably, civilians on both sides of the contact line continue to bear the burden of the tensions and resulting insecurity. I further have to note with deep concern that the impediments to the SMM's mandated freedom of movement have not only persisted, but escalated in the past year. In times of heightened tensions in and around Ukraine, when the mission's impartial and objective reporting is vital, these restrictions are especially unacceptable since they limit the mission's capabilities. The SMM has been vilified in public rhetoric, and mission members have at times been intimidated. Our technical monitoring tools are subjected to intense interference daily. The mission suffered temporary blockades of operations in Donetsk region last October. In Luhansk region, the SMM is also subjected to a blockade. SMM's sustainability is under risk as it has been deprived of its operational freedom and independence. In this context, I also wish to highlight my concern with the fact that the contact line remains exceedingly difficult to cross, both for SMM and civilians. It increasingly looks like and feels like a border, which it transects and divides families and communities and provision of services. Before elaborating on these developments, I wish to stress that in such challenging circumstances, the political will of the sides to strictly adhere to the ceasefire and reduce tensions is imperative. Silence along the contact line is of utmost importance for allowing space for negotiations. Abstaining from inflammatory public rhetoric is also essential. Mr. President, since I last briefed the esteemed Council, the overall security situation along the contact line in eastern Ukraine has remained volatile. After the unprecedented period of relative calm that followed the 22nd July 2020 Trilateral Contact Group Agreement on measures to strengthen the ceasefire throughout 2021, we saw a gradual but sustained increase in the level of armed violence. In 2021, between August and December in particular, the mission recorded high numbers of ceasefire violations, including increased use of heavy weapons that the sides had committed to withdraw, as well as their consequences in civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure. In November, the SMM recorded levels of kinetic activity, including the more destructive weapons, worryingly close to those recorded prior to July 22nd measures agreement. At the 22nd December 2021 TCG meeting, the participants expressed strong determination to uphold the ceasefire regime. The first month following that meeting saw a considerable decrease in the level of violence by some 60%. But tensions nevertheless remain high, fueled also by the wider discussions surrounding the security situation in and around Ukraine. Of serious concern is the fact that in 2021, the SMM recorded ceasefire violations in and near the three symbolically important pilot disengagement areas, including with the use of proscribed weapons, In Luhansk region, in particular, the wider Pervomaisk-Popasna-Zolote area consistently remained a hotspot. On 3 December, the SMM recorded a violent exchange of fire inside and near the Stanislavski disengagement and crossing point. This was an especially dangerous situation as civilians in transit, including children, were put at risk. This was the first time since April 2020 that SMM recorded ceasefire violations inside this area. Importantly, there, the benefits of this engagement had been clearly demonstrated as it allowed for the reconstruction of the Statska-Luhansk bridge, one of the symbols of this conflict. I underline the significance of violence in these three areas as it provides insight into the side's will, or at times its absence, to adhere to their commitments. In this context, I also wish to share my deep concern over the side's holding of live fire exercises inside the security zone throughout 2021 and since the start of 2022. These ceasefire violations deserve our particular attention as they violate both the comprehensive ceasefire regime and the specific TCG decision of 3 March 2016 prohibiting the conduct of such exercises. Last month, they were approximately 10% of all ceasefire violations recorded by the SMM. Since the beginning of 2022, the mission is already recording on average twice as many ceasefire violations per day as it did over the same period in 2021, when the side's adherence to the ceasefire had already started fraying. As I noted, the increasing levels of violence with the use of heavy weapons inevitably led to a rise in the number of corroborated civilian casualties due to shelling and small arms fire. In 2021, the SMM corroborated more civilian casualties due to shelling and small arms fire, 48, than those caused by mines and other explosive objects. Nearly 60% of the corroborated civilian casualties as a result of shelling and small arms fire, as well as nearly 70% of all cases of damage to civilian objects and the infrastructure sites were recorded between October and November last year. Other violations of commitments undertaken by the sides have also continued. The SMM recorded new trench extensions and improvements to positions, the presence of heavy weapons and military-type positions in residential areas, and the increased use of non-SMM unmanned aerial vehicles. As a last point on this issue, it is worth mentioning that violations occur on either side of the contact line. Mr. President, regrettably, discussions in the working group on security issues have been at an impasse for the past year. In principle agreements reached in 2020 on 19 demining areas, an updated mine action plan, 4 new disengagement areas, and a draft addendum to clarify some aspects of the framework decision on disengagement have not been actioned. The security-related conclusions of the 2019 Normandy 4 Paris Summit require new political impetus to be translated into tangible progress. Since April 2021, participants have been discussing a draft addendum to the 22nd July measures agreement, but common ground has yet to be found. As I underlined last year, such mechanism would facilitate the escalation, address the persistent issue of impunity, and contribute to building confidence on the ground. It will demonstrate the side's political will to act in line with their commitments. Mr. President, I wish to underline that the communities along the contact line are deeply traumatized by living in constant danger and uncertainty. I already mentioned the 48 casualties caused by small arms fire or shelling. In 2021, the SMM corroborated another 43 cases of people injured or killed by mines, unexploded ordnance, and other explosive devices. It is imperative that the sides do their utmost to mitigate these constant threats, even unilaterally, in parallel with the negotiations on overall solutions. Mr. President, the challenges of the ongoing pandemic have also endured and continue to make daily life even more challenging for civilians on both sides of the contact line. The past year saw no improvement in civilians' freedom of movement between the government and non-government controlled areas of Ukraine. Crossing the contact line remains limited to 2 of the 5 existing crossing points. Only the pedestrian crossing at Stanislavski Bridge is accessible on a daily basis. There has been no progress in opening of the 2 new crossings at Zolote and Shastia, even though in principle agreement on their opening was reached in July 2020. Even as some of the pandemic-related restrictions were eased last year, official data shows that crossings in 2021 remain a mere 5% of the pre-pandemic levels. These are not just statistics, they represent the elderly who can no longer access their pensions, as well as the young who are losing out on educational and economic opportunities. Access to other services, including healthcare and documentation, such as passports, birth, and death certificates, is being severely curtailed, while people, family, friends, communities are being separated from each other. Estrangement between communities spanning the contact line should not become entrenched. The needs and the rights of civilians should take precedence. Both existing and new crossing points should be fully opened and all restrictions on both sides of the contact line lifted without delay. In these challenging circumstances, it is also vital that critical infrastructure that civilians depend on for their basic needs remain operational and protected from the impact of armed violence. Last year, the SMM continued facilitating and monitoring repairs to gas, water, and electricity infrastructure objects, benefiting millions of civilians on both sides of the contact line. Regrettably, since February 2021, and especially in the wake of an incident inside the disengagement area near Zolote in October, the process of exchanging security guarantees among the sides has been at an impasse, particularly in Luhansk region. I would like to underline that the exchange of security guarantees, which are essential for conducting vital repairs, had previously not been linked to increased tensions on the ground. This process should not be politicized as it is done now. Mr. President, reviewing these challenges, it appears to me that there has never been a greater need for impartial and objective monitoring delivered by SMM. The sides also recognize the importance of the mission's work. Their reactions to the temporary relocation of some mission members last weekend clearly indicated that. Throughout the past year, the SMM has continued managing the challenges I described and performing its mandated tasks. However, since I last briefed this council, the mission's work has continued to be undermined by persistent and escalating constraints on its freedom of movement, predominantly in areas outside government control. I need to underline that freedom of movement is what makes monitoring as foreseen in the mandate. It is essential for enabling the SMM to serve as an impartial eye and ear of the international community in Ukraine. I wish to recall that this freedom of movement is a shrine in the mission's mandate as well as in Minsk agreements. In 2021, some 91% of all freedom of movement restrictions experienced by SMM took place in non-government controlled areas. The past year saw missions movements across the contact line increasingly denied, delayed, and conditioned. These impediments continued to undermine the SMM's operational unity and threaten the sustainability of its work in non-government controlled areas. Impediments to SMM's use of technical monitoring tools have also continued on both sides of the contact line. Instances of gunfire assessed as targeting SMM's unmanned aerial vehicles almost doubled. the intensity of GPS signal interference in 2021 reached unusually high levels. The degradation of our aerial environment in 2021 particularly affected the SMM's long-range waveways. This platform is the only one that can monitor the full length of the contact line and the areas near the border outside government control 24/7 basis. However, over 80% of the flights encountered interference. Mr. President, the past year has been difficult on many levels. At a time of heightened tensions on the ground and in public rhetoric, it is imperative for the signatories of the Minsk agreements to adhere to all their commitments, first and foremost among them, to strictly adhere to ceasefire regime. Political impasse and increased violence reinforce one another. I hope that the recent resumption of the Normandy 4 consultations and other confidence-building efforts under the auspices of the OSCE will provide much-needed political impetus to relieve tensions in the region and for conflict resolution process to move forward. The restoration of SMM's freedom of movement is meanwhile paramount in order that the mission can do its job. The SMM should be actively supported by the sites in installing new cameras and opening long-planned forward patrol bases. The SMM should again be able to cross the contact line without arbitrary condition and denials. Its unimpeded and unconditional access through the contact line, especially in Luhansk region, must be restored without delay. Attempts to vilify the mission by public accusing it of bias should also come to an end. The impasse in exchange of security guarantees among the sides also requires urgent resolution all along the contact line. The capacity on the ground exists. The will to use it needs to be strengthened and be guided solely by the needs of the long-suffering civilians. The SMM remains available to facilitate constructive efforts in this regard. Mr. President, before concluding my remarks, I would like to highlight 2 points. I remain convinced that the SMM's role remains critical to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability, and security. Yet, our key challenge has been to ensure the space for the implementation of that mandate. Lacking any way to enforce this implementation, we need the strong and sustained support of the international community to urge the sides to implement their commitments and restore SMM's freedom of movement. Where there is a political will, there is a way, and I remember particularly the reconstruction of the Luhansk bridge after so many years and the encouraging periods of quiet that briefly followed the July 22nd measures agreement. Progress is possible. I'm also compelled to highlight the continuing plight of civilians. I have described the death and injury caused by continued exchanges of fire and by mines. However, allow me to also note that with the contact line nearly completely sealed for 2 years already, people-to-people contacts have been greatly disrupted and communities, even families, have been divided due to no fault of their own. This is taking place against the background of other developments that are further deepening the divide between people living on both sides of the contact line. The political challenges of this 8-year conflict should not eclipse the human cost. I implore the signatories of the Minsk agreements to be mindful of these costs and redouble their efforts. I also urge the members of this venerable council to work with the sides and support their efforts to that end. If you allow me, Mr. President, I would also like to give some information about the developments of today's morning hours. Between yesterday evening and 11:20 Kiev today, Kiev time today, the SMM has recorded 500 explosions along the contact line. the wider areas of disengagement areas near Staniska, Luhansk, Zolote were particularly kinetic. After 11:20, we have recorded about 30 explosions, so the tension may seem to be easy. During the early hours, around noon, the SMM has asked the sides to strictly adhere to the ceasefire commitments. It is critically important to de-escalate immediately to avoid further aggravation of the situation. SMM is aware and is following up on the reports of civilian casualties, damage to civilian infrastructure, and all along the contact line during the last 24 hours. We will continue to follow up the security situation as much as our resources allow, of course. The increased kinetic activity happened along roughly 200 kilometers of the contact line, basically on the Luhansk Oblast, and many SMM patrols are still returning and in the process of reporting. SMM patrols have visited the sites of the alleged damage to kindergarten and railway station in the government-controlled part of Staniska, Luhansk. At the kindergarten, the SMM saw fresh damage to its facade. Of course, the details will be reported after all the corroboration effort has been completed, and we will do it as soon as possible because we are aware of the importance of these reports in reducing the tensions in the area. In Marinka and Karamchuk, where there were allegations, SMM itself didn't register ceasefire violations, and we are going to follow up. We are actually following up the allegations that reached to us. But it is important that the sides are called to reduce tensions and ceasefire, and also they do themselves being mindful of the high tensions in the region. I thank you very much.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Чевика за его брифинг. А сейчас я предоставляю слово госпоже Татьяне Монтян.
Thank you, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. This is the technician. Can you please unmute your microphone? Ma'am, your microphone is still muted. Please unmute your microphone.
Слышно?
We can hear you.
Слышно, да? Еще раз добрый день, дамы и господа. Надеюсь, теперь меня слышно. Я внимательно прослушала все, что говорили ораторы до меня. И хочу вам сказать, что я абсолютно уверена, что вы все прекрасно знаете, что никогда киевские власти не собирались выполнять ни первые Минские соглашения, ни тем более вторые. Для них это был просто перерыв для того, чтобы сказать, да, мы выполним, а за это время Запад накачает нас оружием, укрепит наши вооруженные силы, и мы надеемся, что через некоторое время мы попробуем отбить мятежные республики силой. Они не то, что не хотят разговаривать с республиками, и Зеленский сказал об этом прямо, вот прямо сейчас, что он не видит смысла разговаривать с Донецком и Луганском. Они не хотят разговаривать с гражданским обществом,
They do not want to have conversations with the civil society, even within Ukraine. People who do not want to go to Europe or NATO, people who are against the coup d'etat, who want to live in peace and friendship in Russia and other countries. These people, not only are they not represented within Ukrainian politics at all, they are being criminally prosecuted. I'm a criminal lawyer. Ruslan Kataba simply posted a video on YouTube saying that he is in favor of peace and against war in Donbass. And he has been on trial since 2015, and the accusation is high treason. I went to Donbass personally to visit one of the commanders, now dead, Mr. Moskovy, so was to take detainee back. And I saw a huge number of people whose only fault is that they're against Maidan, against coup d'etat, against NATO and Europe. And you now want to tell me that those people who sit in judgment over others people or other people's because they have placed a like in social networks. People who closed all opposition channels, who are prosecuting all opposition politics, that these people are going to hold conversation with Donetsk and Lugansk. It is very clear that this is in principle and a possibility. This is a matter and antimatter. They annihilate each other. So what is the problem? What was the difficulty to provide a special status in the past 5 years? They are not going to do that because any different thinking in Ukraine is being squashed. People who are in Ukraine against Maidan, against the coup d'etat, against war, the enemies of the people, they have no right to take the floors anywhere at all. They have no political parties. They have no civil society associations. They have no right to speak in their country. They don't have that right at all. And of course, even after that, how can you ask that Kiev be talking to Lugansk and Donetsk? I am sure you understand that this will never, ever, ever happen. One of the previous speakers said, well, I regret that despite the efforts of Germany and France, the Kiev regime does not want to implement the Kiev agreements. I'm certain that the West allows the Kiev regime to not implement. If this were not the case, all of the Minsk agreements would have been implemented a long time ago. Please do not say that Kiev is an independent entity here, that Ukraine is independent. It is a colony of a collective West, where everything is decided by the people who came in from the outside, who organized the Maidan and the coup d'etat and plunged my country into slavery. And these are the same people stand in the way of implementing the Minsk agreement. And they will not allow the agreements to be implemented. I'm certain of it. Because the real goal of the West, despite all the peace-loving speeches I've heard, including here, is to make sure that Kiev attacks the republics and that Russia is
bogged into this war. No explanation for the Western hysterics when they say that Russia is about to invade. And Biden just said, I just listened to it as we were having this meeting. That's what he said. There is no other goal that the West has. The only goal is to organize war. If this were not the case, then the puppet government of Ukraine would have been compelled to implement the Minsk agreements a long time ago. And since this is not taking place, then we can state one thing and one thing only. The West wants a war with Russia. And it wants a war to take place on the territory of Ukraine. We are not a chessboard, we are a people of Ukraine. And the people in the unrecognized republics are simply pawns in political games. There's nothing else that can be said here. And I am sure that you yourselves understand that very well. I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to say this to your face. I am convinced that you will lead the events to a war. The events today in the republics when they were shelled throughout the contact line have convinced me of that completely. Ukraine, the Kiev regime, for almost 8 years have been shelling about 100,000 people using heavy artillery. OSCE have the moniker of blind observers in the territories react to this not at all. That side, which is under the control of the Kiev regime, children are not killed. Not a single child has been killed, and buildings are standing up. This only happens in the unrecognized republic, and I visited them personally. I am telling you this about firsthand because I traveled down the entire contact line and I saw how peaceful civilians, unprotected, vulnerable people are being killed. The people who did not manage to leave, they're old people, they're women with children, or they're handicapped. Those who could have left the area a long time ago. So these long-suffering people are hostages there, and they're in the number of 100,000. And the entire Europe is, for the 8th year running, looking duplicitously at the suffering of these people, whilst at the same time saying that there is no alternative to the Minsk agreements. Well, fine, then compel your marionettes from the Kiev regime to implement them, and please, or stop saying that there is no alternative to them. I thank you for your attention.
За ее брифинг.
I thank Ms. Татьяна Манчан for her briefing.
Сейчас я сделаю заявление в своем качестве заместителя министра иностранных дел Российской Федерации. Хотели бы поблагодарить за высказанные оценки заместителя генсекретаря ООН Розмари Ди Карло, спецпредставителя действующего представителя ОБСЕ в Минской контактной группе Мика Кинунина и главу специальной мониторинговой миссии ОБСЕ Халита Чевика. Признательны госпоже Татьяне Манчан за ценную весьма информацию из первых рук о том, как реализуются на практике решения Совета Безопасности ООН по урегулированию внутриукраинского конфликта. Дата сегодняшнего заседания выбрана нами не случайно. В этот день, 7 лет назад, Совет Безопасности ООН в своей резолюции 2202 единодушно утвердил комплекс мер по выполнению Минских соглашений в качестве единственной международно-правовой основы урегулирования гражданского конфликта на востоке Украины. Именно поэтому основной задачей сегодняшней встречи мы видим подтверждение Совета Безопасности безальтернативности этого судьбоносного для Украины документа. К сожалению, спустя 7 лет у нас появляется все больше оснований полагать, что реализация Минского комплекса мер в планы наших украинских соседей по-прежнему входит. Они уже говорят об этом в открытую. Приведу лишь несколько наиболее свежих примеров. Буквально вчера вице-премьер-министр Украины Ирина Верещук утверждала, что никаких новых законов об особом статусе Донбасса
there
никаких
will
согласований
be
напрямую не
no
будет.
new
Это я
laws on the
цитирую.
special status of
И это после
Donbass, or
разговора
no
Зеленского с
direct
канцлером
agreements.
Шольцем.
And this took place
Она,
after Zelensky
кстати,
had
тогда же
a
призналась, что
meeting
никакого
with
давления
Chancellor
со стороны
Scholz.
Запада
She
по
also
выполнению Минска
acknowledged that
Киев
there
не
is no
ощущает.
pressure exerted by West on
4
them to
февраля в
implement the
интервью
Minsk
украинскому
agreements.
телеканалу
On the
1
4th of
плюс 1
February, there
Миндел
was
Украины
an
Кулеба заявил,
interview
что
by the
Минские
Ukrainian
соглашения
channel 1+1
не могут
by
быть
the Minister
выполнены
of
на
Foreign
российских
Affairs,
условиях,
Kuleba.
к которым
He
он
said that the
почему-то
Minsk
отнес
agreement
прямой диалог
cannot
между
be
Украиной и
implemented
Донбассом.
in Russian terms,
Хотя
and in
это
those
условие
terms he thinks
четко
this direct
зафиксировано в
dialogue
Кодексе мира.
between Ukraine and
Эту же мысль
Donbass, despite the
проводил
fact that
глава
this is
офиса
clearly
президента
stated in
Украины
the package
Ермак
of measures.
на недавней
This
встрече
same idea was
политсоветников в
expressed
нормандском
by the
формате
head of
в Париже.
presidential
Ранее
Ukrainian
2
presidential
февраля
administration
Кулеба
Yermak
утверждал,
at the
что ни один
recent
регион
meeting
Украины
in
не будет
Normandy.
иметь права
Earlier,
вето
on
на
the 2nd of
общегосударственные
February, Mr.
решения.
Kuleba said that
Это
no
высечено в
Ukrainian
камне,
region will
так
have
что
a veto
никакого
right
особого
on
статуса, как
state
представляет
decisions. This
Россия,
is
никакого
cast
права
in
вето не
stone,
будет.
so there will be no special
Днем ранее,
status,
1
as
февраля,
Russia says
Зеленский
no
тоже напомнил
veto.
всему миру
One
о
day earlier, on the 1st of
недоговороспособности
February,
Украины,
Zelensky also
намекая на
recalled
наличие
for the world
альтернативного решения
entire
конфликта в
of
Донбассе. Он
Ukrainia's
сказал, что
inability
в
to
Киеве по-разному
negotiate.
относятся к порядку выполнения
He
тех
hinted at an
или иных пунктов
alternative
Минских соглашений.
solution to the conflict in Donbass
31
and says
января
that
в интервью агентства
Kiev
Associated
has a
Press
different view to
секретарь
the
Совета национальной
order of
безопасности
the
и обороны Украины
implementing
Данилов
the provisions of the Minsk
заявил о том,
agreement.
что
On the
выполнение
31st of
Минских
January,
соглашений
in the interview
означает
to
разрушение
Associated
страны.
Press, the
Когда
Secretary
они
of
были
the National
подписаны
Security
под дулом
Defense
русских
Council
пушек, а
stated that
немцы и
the
французы
implementation
смотрели,
of the Minsk
всем
agreement
разумным
means
людям уже было
destroying of the
ясно, что
country.
реализовать эти
They
документы
were signed
невозможно.
at the barrel of Russian
Конец цитаты.
guns, and Germans and the
Украинские
French
политики
looked on,
последовательно
and
пытаются
every
укоренить на Западе
rational
мнение о
person
том,
understood that
что
the
Минские
implementation is
соглашения
impossible.
противоречат
Ukrainian
интересам Украины.
politics are trying
Но
to
если задача
implant the
построения
opinion
мира на своей
in the
земле
West that
входит в
the
национальные
Minsk
интересы Украины,
agreements are against the national
одно
interest of Ukraine.
утверждение
But
быть не
if the
должно.
goal of building
Другая
peace on their
распространенная
own land is
отговорка
part of the
подобного
national
рода
interest of
о
Ukraine,
том,
well,
что
such
якобы
statements are out
некие
of
свои
place.
обязательства по Минским
Another
соглашениям
excuse that we
не
hear
выполняет
here is
Россия.
that Russia is not
Не
implementing some of
исключаю,
its
что
obligations
подобные
in the Minsk
утверждения мы
agreements.
услышим и
And it is very
сегодня.
possible that this is
При этом
something that
очевидно,
we'll
что
also
для
hear
такой
here
постановки
today.
вопроса нет никаких
At the same
оснований,
time, it's obvious
так
that there are
как
absolutely no
упоминание
grounds
России
for
в
that
тексте
because
Минских
there is
соглашений
no mention of Russia
приведу
in
только
the
одно
text
мнение на
of
этот
the
счет,
Minsk agreements.
причем не
Let me just
кого-либо,
give you
а
one
бывшего
opinion
судьи
on this,
Конституционного
not
суда
by
Украины
anyone,
Виктора
but by a
Шишкина,
judge from
который
the
недавно предложил открыть
Constitutional
уголовные дела
Court
против
of
причастных к
Ukraine. He
подписанию
very
Минских
recently
соглашений
proposed
Леонида
opening
Кучмы и
criminal
Петра Порошенко.
prosecution
Последний
against
обвиняется в том, что,
those who
цитирую,
participated
Минск
in the
предусматривает
working out of
20
Minsk
обязательств
agreements,
для
Leonid
Украины,
Kuchma and Petro
6
Poroshenko. And the
для
reason, he says, and I
ОБСЕ,
quote,
для
Minsk
2
provides
для
for 20
Донбасса и ни
obligations placed on
одного
Ukraine,
для
6
России.
on
Конец
OSCE,
цитаты.
2 on Donbass, and not a
Уважаемые
single one
коллеги,
for Russia. End of quote.
позвольте мне еще раз
Colleagues,
кратко напомнить
please
содержание
allow me to,
документа,
yet once again,
которому
very
посвящено
briefly
наше сегодняшнее
recall the
заседание.
contents of the document we're
Перечислю его
discussing
по
at this
пунктам,
meeting of ours.
порядок
Let me
выполнения
list it
которых
item
четко
by item,
прописан
and the
и
order
не
in
может
which
быть
they are to be
изменен.
implemented is very clearly
Первое
stated. It cannot be
прекращение огня.
changed. First,
Второе отвод
ceasefire.
вооружений.
Second, withdrawal of
Третье
weapons. Three,
мониторинг ОБСЕ.
OSCE monitoring.
Четвертое
Four,
начало
launching a
диалога Киева с
dialogue
Донбассом.
between Kiev and
Пятое
Donbass.
амнистия.
Five,
Шестое
amnesty.
обмен
Six,
удерживаемыми лицами.
exchange of detainees.
Седьмое
Seven,
гуманитарный
humanitarian
доступ.
access.
Восьмое отмена
Eight,
экономической блокады.
lifting the economic
Девятое
blockade.
передача Киеву
Nine,
контроля над
transfer to the
границей, если
Kiev
выполнен
border
пункт
control,
11.
provided
Десятое
item
вывод
11
иностранных
is
формирований
implemented.
на
10,
нем.
withdrawal
11.
of
Новая
foreign
конституция,
formations and mercenaries.
закрепляющая особый
11,
статус
new
Донбасса.
constitutions
12.
providing special
Согласование
status for
порядка
Donbass.
проведения выборов.
12,
И 13.
agreeing on the order of conducting
интенсификация
elections.
работы
And 13,
контактной группы
intensifying the work of the contact group
Спустя
in Minsk.
7 лет очевидно,
7
ни одно из
years down the
положений
road, it
комплекса
is
мер
clear
Украиной
that none of the
Украиной
provisions of the package
полноценно
of
не
measures
выполнено.
have been implemented
Начиная
by
с первого
Ukraine
пункта
in full.
прекращения огня.
Starting with the first one,
Корень проблемы –
ceasefire.
систематическое
And the
нежелание
root of
Киева
the problem
вступать в
here is
прямой диалог
systematic
с
lack of
полномочными
desire of
представителями
Kiev
Донецка и
to
Луганска
get
в
into a
контактной
direct
группе.
dialogue with the authorized representative of
Это при том,
Donetsk
что
and
такой диалог
Lugansk in the
прямо
contact group. whereas this is a dialogue that is clearly directly provided in items 4, 9, 11, and 12 of the document. This is not our requirement. This is something that is stated in the document. It's an obligation on Ukraine. And this is something that our neighbors increasingly bring into question, and thus risk undermining all of Minsk process, which could lead to devastating consequences for Ukraine. Ukraine stubbornly refuses to implement the provisions of the Minsk on direct dialogue with Donbass, interim self-governance, restoring socioeconomic links, constitutional reform. And currently, the Verkhovная Rada has a draft on decentralization. It's not agreed with Donbass, and it is not provide for a special
в
status.
рамках координационного
Ukrainian
механизма,
side
предлагая
has
различные
taken
варианты,
course to
не позволяющие
completely
эффективно реагировать
move
на случаи
away from
нарушения
a direct
режима
interaction
прекращения
with
огня.
Donbass within the coordination
Попытки
mechanism.
переложить
And
ответственность
they are
на Россию,
providing various
выставить ее
options, but they
стороной
do not
конфликта,
allow for
несостоятельны
effective
и
reaction
не
in
имеют
case there
под
are
собой
violations.
оснований.
Attempts to place the blame
Не
on
могу не сказать,
Russia
что нас крайне
are
разочаровывает,
futile
как минимум,
and
страусиная
baseless, and
позиция
this
наших
only
западных коллег,
hides the goal of
пытающихся
shifting
не
the
замечать
blame
эти
away
очевидные
from
вещи.
Ukraine. I
Удивляет также, что,
must
вводя
say
в
that
тень
we
Минский
are
комплекс
very
мер, они
disappointed
делают
by the
акцент на работу
ostrich-like
на
position
нормандском
of our
формате.
Western colleagues who are
Хочу
trying
напомнить,
not
что
to see
нормандский
obvious
формат,
things. We
согласно
are
приложению 2
surprised that they're
резолюции
putting into
2202
the
Совета
shadow the
Безопасности
Minsk
ООН,
complex measures, but they
является
are
контрольным
placing
механизмом
the
по выполнению
emphasis on
Минских
the Normand
соглашений,
format. I'd
а
like to
отнюдь
recall the
не
Normand
форматом
format,
согласования
according to
новых
Annex
решений.
2 of the resolution,
На
is a
протяжении
mechanism
7
to
лет
control implementation, but
Россия
not
на
a
всех
place where
возможных
new
площадках
decisions could be
призывала
discussed.
западных
For 7
покровителей
years,
Киева надавить
Russia
на
has
своих
been
подопечных
calling
для
in all
выполнения Минских
platforms
соглашений.
for
Вместо
the
этого они
Western
занимались полностью
sponsors
противоположным.
to exert pressure on
Растущее
Kiev
чувство
to implement the
безнаказанности
Minsk
и
agreements.
вседозволенности подстрекало
They were
горячие
doing
головы
exactly
в
the
Киеве
opposite.
на
So
бесконечные
the
новые
increasing
отговорки
feeling
и
of
военные авантюры
impunity
против собственного
pushed the
народа.
Ukrainian hot
В
heads
результате
to new
мы
excuses
имеем
and military
то, что
adventures
имеем.
against their own people. And
Тысячи
this is
жертв
what we have.
внутреннего
We have
вооруженного конфликта.
thousands of
Многомиллионное
victims
население
of the
Донбасса
internal armed
по-прежнему
conflict.
выставляется
Many
чужим
millions in
в
Donbass
собственной стране.
are still
Против него направлены
presented
дулы
as foreigners
автоматов,
in their
снайперских
own
винтовок
country.
и
They
гаубиц,
have automatic
нацеленных
rifles,
ударные
sniper
беспилотники.
rifles, howitzers, and
А украинские
strike
представители
drones
продолжают
targeted at
придумывать
them.
новые поводы не
Ukrainian
выполнять свои
representatives
обязательства и отдавать приказы
keep
на
coming up
расстрелы
with new
мирного населения.
excuses not to implement their
Вы знаете, что такое
agreements.
аллея ангелов? Это мемориальный комплекс
Order
в
to
Донецке
show
в память
their
о
own
детях,
people. There is
погибших
an
от
alley
рук
of
украинских
angels, a
военных.
memorial complex in
Таких,
Donetsk
как
to
те, которые
commemorate the
погибли на
children
детском пляже
who
донбасского
died
города
at
Зубрес.
the hands of
13 августа
Ukrainian military.
2014 года он стал
Those who
мишенью для
died
ВВС
at the
Украины.
children's
В
beach
результате
in
обстрела тогда
Zurgus
погибли
on the
более
13th
20
of August. He
человек,
was
десятки
targeted by the
получили
Air Force of
ранения.
Ukraine. 20
Местная
people
жительница,
died,
24-летняя
dozens were
Анастасия
wounded.
Рубин,
A
была на том пляже вместе со
24-year-old
своим
Anastasia
двухлетним
Rubin,
сыном
a
Максимом,
local, was
когда
there with
ВСУ
her
начали обстрел
son
города из
at the
ракетной системы
time when the
залпового огня.
Ukrainian Air Force started
Один из
shelling the
снарядов
town
разорвался прямо рядом с
from
ними.
their multiple
Вокруг было все в
rocket
дыму,
launch
в
system.
крови. На
One
земле лежали
of the
окровавленные
charges
человеки.
exploded right next to them. Everything was
Этот
covered
и
in
многие
blood and
другие подобные
smoke
эпизоды собраны Следственным
and
комитетом
bloodied
России
bodies of
и
children.
медиахолдингом РТ
This
в
and
подборке
other
преступлений
similar
украинских
episodes were
военных с
compiled
применением
by the
запрещенных
investigative
средств и
committee of
методов
Russia
ведения
and
войны.
the RT
Наше
media
представительство при
in a
ООН распространило
compilation
вчера эти материалы среди государств,
showing
членов
the
Совета
Ukrainian
Безопасности ООН.
military using
Попрошу
prohibited means or
посмотреть
ways
эти
of
материалы. Но
means,
попрошу быть
and
готовым,
our
что вы
UN mission
увидите
have
ужасную
compiled
сцену.
that and disseminated this to members of the Security
О том, как
Council.
Киев
Please
привержен
take a look at
выполнению
them, you'll be
обязательств по
horrified
комплексу
by
мер,
them.
свидетельствует о похищении в
The
октябре
Kiev's
прошлого года
commitment
наблюдателя от
to
Луганска в
the
совместном
complex of
центре по
measures can
координации и
also
контролю
be
Андрея Косяка.
illustrated by the
Господин Кинунин,
abduction
был бы
last
вам
year
признателен за рассказ об этом
in
эпизоде.
Lugansk
Знаем,
from
что
the
этот
Joint Center on Convention
вероломный
Control
поступок стал прямым
of
нарушением
Andrea
пункта
Cossack.
5
Mr.
комплекса
Kinnunen, we
мер,
would be very grateful
который
if you could tell
запрещает
us about this
преследование и
episode.
наказание лиц
This
за
is a
событиями,
treacherous
имевшими место в
event,
отдельных
and
районах
it is a direct
Донецкой и
violation
Луганской
of
областей
item
Украины
5
для
of the conflict
преследования.
measures, which prohibits the prosecution
Уважаемые
and
коллеги,
punishment of persons in
в завершение хотел бы выразить
connection
надежду,
with
что
the events
представители
in
западных
Donetsk and
стран
Luhansk.
удержатся от соблазна в
I
угоду
would like to
телекамерам
finally say that
превратить
you will
наше
be able to
сегодняшнее
resist
заседание
the
в
temptation
площадку для
to play to the
безосновательных,
cameras
агрессивных,
and will
словесных
not
упражнений
make this
и
meeting
вынести
of
на
ours
него свои
into a
ничем не
circus,
подтвержденные обвинения
will
в том, что
not
Россия якобы
present
собирается
here
напасть на
baseless
Украину.
accusations saying
Мне
that
кажется,
Russia
уже было
allegedly was
достаточно
going to
спекуляций
attack
на эту
Ukraine.
тему, в том
I
числе и на
think we've had
созданном
enough
США
speculation on that,
заседании Совета
including
Безопасности
the Security
31
Council
января.
meeting on the 31st
Мы давно
of
уже
January
все, что
convened by the
требовалось,
United States.
пояснили и
We have
заявили.
long ago clarified
Объявленная дата
everything
мнимого
and
вторжения
explained
уже прошла,
everything. And
поэтому,
the
наверное, не надо ставить себе неловкое
announced
положение.
date of the
Благодарю
so-called
вас за
invasion
внимание.
is behind us, so therefore
my advice to you
Я
is
вновь
not
приступаю
present
к
yourself
исполнению
in an
обязанностей
awkward
председателя
situation.
Совета.
I thank you for your attention.
Сейчас
And
я
now
предоставляю
I
слово
resume my
Его
function
превосходительству государственному
as
секретарю
President
Соединенных
of the
Штатов
Council,
Америки
and I now give the floor to
господину
His
Энтони
Excellency,
Блинкену.
Mr. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Mr. President, this council was convened today to discuss the implementation of the Minsk agreements, a goal that we all share, despite Russia's persistent violations. These agreements, which were negotiated in 2014 and 2015 and signed by Russia, remain the basis for the peace process to resolve the conflict in eastern Ukraine. This Council's primary responsibility, the very reason for its creation, is the preservation of peace and security. As we meet today, the most immediate threat to peace and security is Russia's looming aggression against Ukraine. The stakes go far beyond Ukraine. This is a moment of peril for the lives and safety of millions of people, as well as for the foundation of the United Nations Charter and the rules-based international order that preserves stability worldwide. This crisis directly affects every member of this Council and every country in the world. Because the basic principles that sustain peace and security, principles that were enshrined in the wake of 2 world wars and a Cold War, are under threat. The principle that one country cannot change the borders of another by force. The principle that one country cannot dictate another's choices or policies or with whom it will associate. The principle of national sovereignty. This is the exact kind of crisis that the United Nations, and specifically this Security Council, was created to prevent. We must address what Russia is doing right now to Ukraine. Over the past months, without provocation or justification, Russia has amassed more than 150,000 troops around Ukraine's borders, in Russia, Belarus, occupied Crimea. Russia says it's drawing down those forces. We do not see that happening on the ground. Our information indicates clearly that these forces, including ground troops, aircraft, ships, are preparing to launch an attack against Ukraine in the coming days. We don't know precisely how things will play out, but here's what the world can expect to see unfold. In fact, it's unfolding right now, today, as Russia takes steps down the path to war and reissued the threat of military action. First, Russia plans to manufacture a pretext for its attack. This could be a violent event that Russia will blame on Ukraine, or an outrageous accusation that Russia will level against the Ukrainian government. We don't know exactly the form it will take. It could be a fabricated so-called terrorist bombing inside Russia, the invented discovery of a mass grave, a staged drone strike against civilians, or a fake, even a real, attack using chemical weapons. Russia may describe this event as ethnic cleansing or a genocide, making a mockery of a concept that we in this chamber do not take lightly, nor do I take lightly, based on my family history. In the past few days, Russian media has already begun to spread some of these false alarms and claims to maximize public outrage, to lay the groundwork for an invented justification for war. Today, that drumbeat has only intensified in Russia's state-controlled media. We've heard some of these basic allegations from Russian-backed speakers here today. Second, in response to this manufactured provocation, the highest levels of the Russian government may theatrically convene emergency meetings to address the so-called crisis. The government will issue proclamations declaring that Russia must respond to defend Russian citizens or ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Next, the attack is planned to begin. Russian missiles and bombs will drop across Ukraine. Communications will be jammed. Cyber attacks will shut down key Ukrainian institutions. After that, Russian tanks and soldiers will advance on key targets that have already been identified and mapped out in detailed plans. We believe these targets include Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million people. And conventional attacks are not all that Russia plans to inflict upon the people of Ukraine. We have information that indicates Russia will target specific groups of Ukrainians. We've been warning the Ukrainian government of all that is coming. And here today, we are laying it out in great detail with the hope that by sharing what we know with the world, We can influence Russia to abandon the path of war and choose a different path while there's still time. Now, I'm mindful that some have called into question our information, recalling previous instances where intelligence ultimately did not bear out. But let me be clear. I am here today not to start a war, but to prevent one. The information I presented here is validated by what we've seen unfolding in plain sight before our eyes for months. And remember that while Russia has repeatedly derided our warnings and alarms as melodrama and nonsense, they have been steadily amassing more than 150,000 troops on Ukraine's borders, as well as the capabilities to conduct a massive military assault. It isn't just us seeing this. Allies and partners see the same thing. And Russia hasn't only been hearing from us. The international chorus has grown louder and louder. If Russia doesn't invade Ukraine, then we will be relieved that Russia changed course and proved our predictions wrong. That would be a far better outcome than the course we're currently on. And we'll gladly accept any criticism that anyone directs at us. As President Biden said, this would be a war of choice. And if Russia makes that choice, we've been clear, along with allies and partners, that our response will be sharp and decisive. President Biden reiterated that forcefully earlier this week. There's another choice Russia can still make if there's any truth to its claim that it's committed to diplomacy. Diplomacy is the only responsible way to resolve this crisis. An essential part of this is through implementation of the Minsk agreements, the subject of our session today. There are a series of commitments that Russia and Ukraine made under Minsk, with the OSCE and the Normandy format partners involved as well. If Russia is prepared to sit with the Ukrainian government and work through the process of implementing these commitments, our friends in France and Germany stand ready to convene senior-level discussions in the Normandy format to settle these issues. Ukraine is ready for this, and we stand fully ready to support the parties. Progress toward resolving the Donbass crisis through the Minsk agreements can reinforce the broader discussions on security issues that we're prepared to engage in with Russia, in coordination with our allies and partners. More than 3 weeks ago, we provided Russia with a paper that detailed concrete reciprocal steps that we can take in the near term to address our respective concerns and advance the collective security interests of Russia, the United States, and our European partners and allies. This morning, we received a response, which we're evaluating. Earlier today, I sent a letter to Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, proposing that we meet next week in Europe, following on our talks in recent weeks, to discuss the steps that we can take to resolve this crisis without conflict. We're also proposing meetings of the NATO-Russia Council and the OSCE Permanent Council. These meetings can pave the way for a summit of key leaders in the context of de-escalation to reach understandings on our mutual security concerns. As lead diplomats for our nations, we have a responsibility to make every effort for diplomacy to succeed, to leave no diplomatic stone unturned. If Russia is committed to diplomacy, we're presenting every opportunity for it to demonstrate that commitment. I have no doubt that the response to my remarks here today will be more dismissals from the Russian government about the United States stoking hysteria or that it has no plans to invade Ukraine. So let me make this simple. The Russian government can announce today, with no qualification, equivocation, or deflection, that Russia will not invade Ukraine. State it clearly, state it plainly to the world, and then demonstrate it by sending your troops, your tanks, your planes back to their barracks and hangars and sending your diplomats to the negotiating table. In the coming days, the world will remember that commitment. or the refusal to make it. I yield the floor.
Я благодарю
I thank
его
His
превосходительство
Excellency,
государственного секретаря США Антони Блинкена
Secretary of State of the
и
United States,
приглашаю,
Mr.
предоставляю
Blinken,
слово его
and
превосходительству
I
государственному
now give
министру
the
по делам
floor
Европы и Северной Америки,
to
Соединенного
Minister
Королевства
of State for
Великобритании и
Europe and North
Северной Ирландии,
America of the United Kingdom
господину
and Great
Джеймсу
Britain and
Клеверли.
Northern Ireland, Mr. James Cleverly.
I thank you, and I thank the briefers for the information they've given today. The United Nations, the OSCE, and the mandate of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission continue to command our full support. The rights of all Ukrainian, whether they are in Kyiv, Lviv, Donetsk, Luhansk, can only be served by peace, diplomacy, and dialogue. I want to make absolutely clear the United Kingdom's support for the implementation of the Minsk agreements as endorsed by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. That resolution reaffirmed the Security Council's full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. It remains the responsibility of all parties to implement fully their commitments and to seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict. In this respect, we condemn the actions taken by the Russian Duma to propose the Russian president recognize the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent. This would directly undermine the Minsk agreements and must be rejected by the Russian authorities in line with the commitments that they have made. We welcome all efforts to support the process and to avoid escalation, including the role of the OSCE and the Normandy format. This remains our long-standing position. Mr. President, let us remind ourselves of the context for the Minsk agreements and the situation in which Ukraine finds itself today. In March 2014, Russia invaded and illegally annexed Crimea in flagrant violation of international law. A few weeks later, in April, Russia instigated a conflict in the Donbass, which it continues to fuel today. More than 14,000 people have lost their lives in the fighting there. Now, today, the Ukrainian people are yet again living under the threat of invasion, with well over 130,000 Russian troops, heavy weaponry, and military vessels amassed and exercising on their northern, eastern, and southern borders, from Belarus to the Black Sea. Let us say clearly what the whole world can see. Russia has deployed the forces necessary to invade Ukraine and now has them readied for action. In the past days, we have heard Russian claims that some units are returning to barracks. It is, however, all too clear that the opposite is in fact true, and the Russian military build-up continues. Russia will say that it has the right to move its forces within its own territory, but no one has the right to threaten the use of force. Russia is patently failing to live up to the international commitments that it has made around military transparency by refusing to adequately explain its military build-up or provide the necessary transparency to build trust and to de-escalate the situation. If the Kremlin is serious about a diplomatic resolution, then it needs to show up to the diplomatic meetings and commit to meaningful OSCE talks, including via Chapter 3 of the OSCE Vienna document. They did not show up on Wednesday, and they do not intend to show up on Friday. Russia's actions are clearly designed to intimidate, to threaten, and to destabilize Ukraine. We know it, they know it, and the international community knows it. Mr. President, Russia called this meeting today to discuss Resolution 2202. That text is very clear on 2 points that reflect the core tenets of the Charter emphasised by the United Nations Secretary-General when he addressed this situation only a few days ago. One, that resolving the situation in eastern regions of Ukraine can only be achieved by peaceful means. And two, that there must be full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Yet, we are seeing increasing disinformation about events in the Donbass that are straight out of the Kremlin playbook, a blatant attempt by the Russian government to fabricate a pretext for the invasion of Ukraine. It is therefore clear that we are at a critical juncture to prevent further escalation. Upholding the core tenets of the Charter in respect of peaceful resolution and respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity has never been more important. Russia must now engage with the diplomatic process we have built up over several decades and on which global security depends, and resolve this situation through peaceful means. If Russia chooses to launch an attack at this time of heightened tension, using disinformation of a pretext, it will show that Russia was never serious about diplomatic engagement. Any Russian invasion now would be a conflict of choice for President Putin and an abdication of Russia's responsibility under the UN Charter to refrain from the use of force and to maintain international peace and security. There should be no doubt that any further Russian incursion into Ukraine would be a massive strategic mistake and a humanitarian disaster that will be met with strength, including significant coordinated sanctions. And we will continue to call out the pattern of deception and disinformation from the Russian state. But if Russia is serious about the Charter and its role as a permanent member of this Council, it should give the Minsk agreements the chance to be implemented, free from coercion. It should engage seriously with diplomacy, and it should stand down all of its troops. There is still time to change path. Conflict can be avoided, and we urge Russia to match its words with actions, to withdraw its troops, to engage meaningfully in talks, and to act in the best interest of peace and security and stability in Europe. I thank you.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Клеверли за его заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Норвегии.
Thank you, President, and I thank the briefers for their statements. Let me also use this opportunity to thank all personnel at the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. They contribute on a daily basis to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability, and security on the ground. The threatening security situation in and around Ukraine is alarming. Norway is deeply concerned by Russian large-scale military buildup in occupied Crimea to the north, east, and south of Ukraine, as well as in Belarus and the Black Sea. The alleged reports of increased shelling are disturbing. They must not be used as a pretext for any military action. Norway calls on Russia to de-escalate and to engage in dialogue, constructively and in good faith, through established international mechanisms. It remains a major obstacle that Russia falsely seeks to portray the conflict in eastern Ukraine as an internal Ukrainian conflict. The reality is that Russia has fueled the conflict by providing financial and military support to the armed formations it backs. President, Norway expresses strong concern regarding the resolution of the Russian State Duma calling for the recognition of the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. We warn against such a step, which would constitute a further violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and directly contradict the spirit and the letter of the Minsk agreements. Norway supports the negotiations in the Normandy format and in the trilateral contact group aimed at ending the conflict through a political settlement and implementation of the Minsk agreements. Norway calls on the parties to uphold their commitments and to engage constructively towards resolving the conflict by peaceful means. We welcome the OSCE chairmanship's renewed European Security Dialogue initiative. We encourage Russia to engage in this format. We also urge Russia to respect its commitments under the Vienna document and contribute to a constructive dialogue and exchange under Chapter 3. Norway upholds a European security order based on international law and national sovereignty and territorial integrity. These principles have repeatedly been invoked by Russia in Council discussions. Norway calls on Russia to respect these principles when it comes to Ukraine. President, through threatening posture and rhetoric and unrealistic demands, Russia is challenging European security. Every country has the right to freely choose its security alignment. We cannot allow the established security architecture to be replaced by spheres of influence. We're concerned that the ceasefire in Donbass from July 2020 has become increasingly fragile. We call on the parties to seek a durable ceasefire and do their utmost to prevent civilian casualties. The humanitarian situation is severe after 8 years of conflict. Civilians are increasingly losing access to essential life-saving services as civilian infrastructure is damaged and destroyed. Any escalation of the conflict would lead to devastating humanitarian consequences. Let me conclude by reiterating Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders in accordance with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. This includes the Crimean Peninsula and its territorial waters. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Норвегии за сделанное заявление. И сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Бразилии.
Thank you. Mr. President, Brazil follows with concern the situation in eastern Ukraine. Persistent political stalemate and prolonged crisis have reached a critical point. In present circumstances, renewed and reinvigorated political resolve by all parties is crucial to address the conflict. Achieving and maintaining peace is our collective responsibility. We appreciate the ongoing political and diplomatic efforts aiming to restore peace and stability in Ukraine and the wider region. We firmly believe a diplomatic solution must be found to the crisis, and we will continue to support credible initiatives to bring a peaceful settlement to it. We reiterate our understanding that Resolution 2202 provides the general guidelines for a peaceful solution to the situation and a permanent stability in eastern Ukraine. Unfortunately, Resolution 2202 has not been fully implemented. Brazil urges all parties to fulfill the letter and the spirit of the Minsk agreements. We urge concerned parties to pursue genuine dialogue on the implementation of Security Resolution 2202, which provides the parameters not only to address the situation in eastern Ukraine, but also to assist diplomatic efforts to overcome the current security challenges in the region. Brazil also welcomes the resumption of talks in the Normandy format and calls for renewed commitment to find ways for a lasting peace in eastern Ukraine. A comprehensive ceasefire, which is the first point of the Minsk agreements, remains an essential element in this process. Beyond that, we need further disengagement of forces and military equipment on the ground. This disengagement must allow unimpeded access of humanitarian relief to people in most desperate need. Furthermore, trust among relevant parties is crucial to strengthening dialogue and achieving a sustainable solution. Negotiations on the parameters to grant special status to certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions must be conducted with a sense of urgency, flexibility, and a spirit of compromise. The implementation of the Minsk agreements must observe full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. All parties must bear in mind the letter of the agreements. We firmly believe that the Security Council has the utmost responsibility to avoid and condemn any attempt of a military solution to this crisis. Dialogue and negotiation are the only way forward to a lasting peace. We urge all parties to take the necessary measures to de-escalate tensions and play a constructive role in reaching a political settlement to the Ukrainian crisis in accordance with international law, particularly the UN Charter. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Бразилии за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Ирландии.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I also want to say a special thank you to Under Secretary General De Carlo and to Ambassadors Kinnunen and Chevik today for their helpful and informative briefings. And I'd like to also recognise the presence of high-level participants at this Council this morning, Mr. President. As I begin my remarks, it's important that I'm clear. Ireland is a steadfast and consistent supporter of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognised borders. Ireland believes in and is fully committed to the core principles enshrined in the UN Charter. These include the sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. Ukraine has the same fundamental right as every other sovereign and independent state to choose its own foreign policy and to ensure the security and defence of its territory. That is a right we hold to be self-evident. It's the right that Ireland struggled to obtain. As Russia's military build-up at Ukraine's border continues to raise tensions, Ireland again calls for calm, de-escalation, and the pursuit of diplomacy. We need to see sustained and credible moves on the ground toward de-escalation. Genuine de-escalation will imply a significant withdrawal of both troops and equipment. We commend all who are engaged in dialogue, including through the Normandy format and Poland as OSCE Chair in Office, for launching a renewed European security dialogue. We support urgent, constructive and resolute engagement through all diplomatic channels. President, the full implementation of Minsk peace agreements and the related conflict resolution efforts in the Normandy format and trilateral contact group are important priorities for us. There is no doubt that we are now at a sensitive moment. Today, we call on all parties to act constructively within both formats. In this regard, we deeply regret the decision of the Russian State Duma to submit a call to recognise as independent entities the non-government controlled areas in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine. This would be a clear violation of the Minsk agreements. We are also concerned at reports of alleged shelling today in eastern Ukraine, as mentioned by Special Representative Kinnunen, which would also be a violation of the Minsk agreements. Mr. President, all signatories of the Minsk agreements agreed on the need for the OSCE's special monitoring mission safe and secure access to the entire territory of Ukraine. The mandate of the SMM was agreed by all 57 OSCE participating states. We therefore remain very concerned at the continuing restrictions imposed on the SMM's freedom of movement. We also regret that SMM equipment has been damaged or interfered with. I want to express our deep regret at the decision by the Russian Federation to refuse to extend the mandate of the Border Observer Mission to monitor the border crossings. We commend the tireless efforts of Ambassadors Kinnunen and Chevik in the Trilateral Contact Group. We see the agreement reached by the group at the end of last year on adherence to the July 2020 ceasefire as an important achievement and a sign that there can be progress if there is genuine political will. President, Eastern Ukraine has already endured 8 years of conflict, resulting in humanitarian disaster, serious human rights violations, and abuses, as reported by the OHCHR. Just as we know that further conflict is not inevitable, we know too that wherever conflict occurs, it is civilians who bear the brunt. Ireland therefore sincerely calls on all sides to work peacefully toward an effective and sustainable political settlement of the conflict and to jumpstart that work today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю за заявление представителя Ирландии и предоставляю слово представителю Индии.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, Special Representative Mikko Kinnunen, and Chief Monitor Yashar Chevik for their comprehensive briefings on the occasion of the 7th anniversary of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements endorsed unanimously by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. I also welcome Ms. Tatiana Montian to our meeting. We welcome the efforts underway for implementation of the Minsk agreements, including through the Trilateral Contact Group and under the Normandy format. We believe that Minsk agreements provides a basis for a negotiated and peaceful settlement of the situation in eastern Ukraine. Accordingly, we urge all parties to continue to engage through all possible diplomatic channels and keep working towards the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. We also believe that meetings under the Normandy format will further facilitate the implementation of the provisions of the Minsk agreements, including its key security and political aspects. In this context, we welcome the recent meetings of the political advisors of the Normandy format countries in Paris and Berlin. We also welcome the unconditional observance of the July 2020 ceasefire, the reaffirmation of Minsk agreements as the basis of work under the Normandy format, and the commitment of all sides to reduce disagreements on the way forward. Any steps that increase tension may best be avoided by all sides in the larger interest of securing international peace and security. Quiet and constructive diplomacy is the need of the hour. India has been in touch with all concerned parties. It is our considered view that the issue can only be resolved through diplomatic dialogue. India's interest is in finding a solution that can provide for immediate de-escalation of tensions, taking into account the legitimate security interests of all countries and aim towards securing long-term peace and stability in the region and beyond. More than 20,000 Indian students and nationals live and study in different parts of Ukraine, including in its border areas. The well-being of Indian nationals is of priority to us. In conclusion, we reiterate our call for the peaceful resolution of the situation by sincere and sustained diplomatic efforts to ensure that concerns of all sides are amicably resolved through constructive dialogue. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Индии за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Кении.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the Special Representative of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission Chief Monitor for their briefings. Kenya cannot contemplate the continued insecurity in eastern Ukraine and the impact it can have on broader security in Europe. Global security is intertwined. Instability in Europe, beyond threatening lives and economies, also disrupts the ability of this important region to play a constructive role in solving the most pressing challenges globally. Insufficient progress in the implementation of the Minsk agreements has been realized since 2014, and that needs to change. Kenya wants to offer 3 brief recommendations. In doing so, we hope that they will contribute to a renewed push by all relevant stakeholders to stabilize a situation that, left to escalate, threatens the very foundations of global stability and the Security Council's ability to fulfill its mandate in multiple conflict situations. First, Kenya maintains that the respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all countries by all states is a cornerstone of global peace. If multilateralism is to be reborn into a system that delivers sustained peace to all, the most powerful states must consistently adhere to international law and to the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries in all regions at all times. We therefore strongly urge all actors to respect the peace, security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The people of Ukraine deserve inclusive governance, peace, and a vibrant economy, which are all deeply dependent on regional stability and cooperation. Second, as we indicated on the 31st of January in this chamber, we believe that this standoff is imminently solvable. Major military powers, particularly those represented in the Security Council, must make a specific and sustained effort to reach arrangements that deliver a minimum level of deconfliction and mutual respect. Otherwise, third countries and global peace and security will suffer greatly as a result of their confrontations. Third, Kenya reiterates the obligations of all the parties to fully implement their commitments in accordance with the Minsk agreements, which provide the most promising roadmap for the peaceful settlement of the current hostilities, including in eastern Ukraine. All parties must take responsibility and reflect that responsibility in a new willingness to agree to compromise. Kenya welcomes the Normandy Format Advisors meeting held earlier this month and the follow-up meeting, which is scheduled for next month, on implementing the Minsk Accords and the consensus reached at the Group Leaders Summit in Paris in December 2019. We commend the diplomatic leaders of the Russian Federation and the United States and their partners and allies for showing a willingness to meet in the coming days to make further progress. Thank you.
Благодарю представителя Кении за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. أود بداية أن أشكر كلا من السيدة روزماري دي كارلو وكيلة الأمين العام للشؤون السياسية وبناء السلام والسيد ميكو كينونن الممثل الخاص للرئيس الحالي لمنظمة الأمن والتعاون في أوروبا في أوكرانيا ومن ومجموعة الاتصال
and in the
الثلاثية
trilateral
والسيد ياسر
contact
حالة
group,
شبك
and
رئيس
Mr.
بعثة الرصد
Yashar
الخاصة
Halik
التابعة
Shafiq, the
لمنظمة
OSCE
الأمن
Special Monitoring
والتعاون
Mission
في
Chief
أوروبا
Monitor for their
على إحاطاتهم
comprehensive
الشاملة.
briefings.
كما استمعنا إلى إحاطة
We've
ممثل
also
المجتمع المدني
took note
السيدة
of
تاتيانا
the Ukrainian civil society activist Mrs. Tatiana
السيد
Moltyan.
الرئيس
Mr.
منذ
President,
اجتماعنا الأخير في
since
31
our meeting
من يناير
on
شهدنا
January
بذل المزيد من
31st, we
الجهود
have seen
الدبلوماسية
intensive
على
diplomatic
مختلف
efforts
المستويات
at various levels,
بما فيها على أعلى
including at
المستويات
the highest
لخفض
levels,
التوترات
to
القائمة
reduce
في
the
أوروبا
current
الشرقية.
tensions in Eastern
كما
Europe.
نرحب بمحادثات
We
هيئة
also
نورماندي
welcome the further
ونأمل أن
engagement
تستمر.
within the Normandy format and hope that these discussions will continue.
فمثل هذه
Such
المناقشات
structured
المنظمة ولا
formats,
سيما تلك التي
particularly
تجمع
those
بين
bringing
روسيا
together
وأوكرانيا
Russia
وباقي
and
الأطراف
Ukraine along with
المعنية
other
مهمة
stakeholders are
لتعزيز الحوار
important for furthering dialogue
وتخفيف حدة
and
التوترات
reducing
ومن
tensions.
شأنها أن تساهم
This would
في إيجاد
also
حل سلمي
help us to
مستدام
find a
يعالج
peaceful and
كافة
sustainable
الشواغل
solution that
الأمنية
would tackle all
لجميع
security
الأطراف.
concerns of all parties.
وعلي تؤكد
In
بلادي
this
على
regard,
ضرورة الحفاظ على
my
الزخم
country stresses
الحالي
the need to
للجهود
maintain
الدبلوماسية
the current
وتعزيزها
momentum
لا
in
سيما من
diplomatic
خلال
efforts
اتخاذ
that
جميع
need to be
الأطراف
built
المعنية
up, in particular
الخطوات
through
اللازمة للانخراط في
steps taken by
حوار
all
بناء
concerned parties
بما
to engage
يخدم
in constructive
وقف
dialogue
التصعيد
in the interest
ويحافظ
of
على الأمن
de-escalation
والاستقرار
and the maintenance
الإقليميين.
of regional security and
ونرى
stability.
هنا أهمية
We
تنفيذ
stress the
اتفاقات
importance
منسك
of
بشكل
implementing the
تام
Minsk
وبحسن
agreements
نية من
in
قبل
full
جميع
and in good
الأطراف.
faith
ونشير
by
كذلك
all
لقرار
parties.
مجلس
We
الأمن
also like to
2102.
refer to Security Council Resolution 2202.
وفي هذا السياق
In this
نحث
context,
جميع
we urge
الأطراف
all
المعنية على
stakeholders
تجنب اتخاذ
to
خطوات
avoid
قد
steps
تزيد من
that would
صعوبة
make
تنفيذ هذه
implementation of the
الاتفاقات.
Minsk agreements more difficult.
كما نشير إلى
We
الدور
also
الهام
note the
لبعثة
important
الرصد
role
الخاصة
of the
إلى أوكرانيا
OSCE Special
التابعة
Monitoring
لمنظمة
Mission to
الأمن والتعاون في
Ukraine,
أوروبا، حيث يعتبر وجودها داعما
whose
لجهود
presence
الحوار وبناء
supports
الثقة بين
efforts for
الأطراف،
dialogue
كما
and
يسهم في
confidence building
تخفيف
between the
حدة
parties. It also
التوترات.
contributes to easing tensions.
وفي الوقت ذاته
At the same
علينا إلى
time,
أهمية
we must
للوضع
pay
الحرج
attention to the
للمدنيين
critical
في شرق
situation
أوكرانيا،
of civilians in
حيث
eastern
أفادت تقارير
Ukraine,
الأمم
where
المتحدة
United
أنه
Nations
يوجد
reports mention that
3.4
there are
مليون
3.4
شخص
million
بحاجة
people in
لتلقي
need
المساعدات
of
الإنسانية،
humanitarian
منهم
assistance,
55%
of whom
من النساء
55% are women
و16%
and
من الأطفال.
16% children.
كما توجد تحديات تتعلق
Furthermore, there
بإيصال
are
المساعدات
obstacles for the
الإنسانية
delivery of
لبعض
humanitarian
المحتاجين
assistance
لا
to
سيما
some
في
of those
المناطق
in need,
القريبة
particularly
من
in
خط
areas
النزاع
near
في
the
شرق
contact
أوكرانيا.
line in eastern
وعليه
Ukraine.
نشدد
We
على
therefore
أهمية عدم
emphasize the
التصعيد في
importance of
التوترات
not
القائمة
escalating
لما
existing
قد تلحقه
tensions,
من
as
أضرار
this may
خطيرة
cause
على
serious
المدنيين.
harm to civilians.
ونهيب في هذا الشأن
In this
بجميع
regard, we
الأطراف
call
على
upon
أهمية
all
عدم
parties
التعرض
not to
للمساعدات
obstruct the
الإنسانية
access to
والمدنيين
humanitarian
في
aid
مناطق
or the
النزاع،
movement of
بما
civilians in
يتماشى
conflict
مع
areas in
التزاماتهم
accordance with
بموجب
their
القانون
obligations
الدولي.
under international law.
وأخيرا نكرر
Finally,
التأكيد
we
على أهمية
reiterate the
احترام القانون
importance of
الدولي
respecting
وميثاق الأمم
international law
المتحدة،
and the Charter of the United
وعلى
Nations,
وجه الخصوص مبادئ
particularly the
السلام
principles
الإقليمية
of
والسيادة
territorial
وحسن
integrity,
الجوار،
sovereignty,
باعتبارها
and good
مرجعا
neighborliness,
أساسيا
as they
لحل
are
الأزمة
essential
القائمة
references for
وتهدئة
resolving the
التوترات في
current
المنطقة.
crisis and calming tensions in the region.
وختاما
In
السيد
conclusion,
الرئيس
Mr.
تجدد
President,
بلادي
the
تأكيدها
UAE
على أهمية
reiterates the
اللجوء للحوار
importance of
البناء
constructive
ومواصلة
dialogue
العمل لإيجاد
and to
حلول
continue
سلمية
effort
تتسق
to
مع
reach
القانون
peaceful
الدولي
solutions
وميثاق
consistent with
الأمم
international law
المتحدة.
and the Charter of the United Nations.
وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Ганы.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to begin by thanking USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing on the prevailing situation in eastern Ukraine as it relates to the implementation of the Minsk agreement, as well as Mr. Mikko Kinnunen, the special representative of the OSCE, chairperson in office in Ukraine and the Trilateral Contact Group, and Mr. Yasser Halik Shafiq, chief monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, for highlighting the efforts of the OSCE in facilitating the political and diplomatic settlements of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. We have taken note also also of the views expressed by Ms. Tatiana Montian, as a civil society representative from Ukraine. I further welcome the participation of the representatives of Germany and Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, in welcoming today's discussion, which enabled the Council to take stock of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk Agreement, adopted on 12 February 2015, my delegation recalls the adoption of Resolution 2202, wherein the Security Council expressed its firm conviction that the crisis in the eastern regions of Ukraine could only be settled through peaceful means. 7 years after the adoption of Resolution 2202, the Council's obligation for the maintenance of international peace and security requires of it a reiteration of its conviction and support for the processes for the further implementation of the Minsk Agreement. Unfortunately, the Minsk Agreements remain largely unimplemented, and the conflict continues to fester in parts of the Donbas region, with increasing civilian casualties and deepening vulnerabilities, mostly of elderly persons and women-led households. More than 14,000 deaths have been recorded since the conflict in eastern Ukraine began. Several thousands of people have been displaced, and 2.9 million people are presently in need of humanitarian assistance. The implications of the situation in Ukraine on regional as well as international peace and security have also been dire. While recognizing the complex fears and complicated concerns which have been expressed by the parties through the Minsk Agreements, we nonetheless believe that good faith conformity with Charter obligations by concerned member states should provide clarity to seize opportunities for supporting continuing dialogue and the engagements required to address the concerns of all parties. In this respect, Ghana is concerned by the increasing tensions along the borders of Ukraine. We recall in this regard the provisions of the Charter which establishes the fundamental norms of the post-1945 international order and require that the international relations of member states should not involve threats of or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of other states. We therefore entreat all parties to maintain the path of dialogue and diplomacy in addressing any differences that exist between and among them. Towards the further implementation of peaceful measures for resolving the crisis in the eastern regions of Ukraine, we make the following points. First, Ghana reaffirms her support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, a bona fide member of the United Nations, whose membership of this organization provides for her guarantees over her internationally recognized borders. Secondly, we know the security concerns of other member states in Europe, especially those in Eastern Europe, and urge a restraint by all in maintaining the Pacific order in Europe, even as efforts continue to address any concerns with the contemporary European security architecture. Third, we welcome the high-level diplomatic engagements to address existing concerns over the situation in Ukraine, including recent discussions among leaders of the Normandy Four that reaffirmed the ceasefire in the eastern region of Ukraine, as well as the OSCE facilitated dialogues at different levels. We continue to urge restraint by all sides, call on the parties to bear in mind the prospective outcomes from ongoing escalation, which do not lead to any strategic gain for any party, and encourage efforts to address both immediate and long-term interests through diplomacy and dialogue. Fourth, we urge renewed dialogue within the Normandy Four process to resolve differences in the interpretation of the sequencing of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk Agreements. As it is said, how can two go on a journey unless they be agreed on the path they intend to take? Fifth, we urge the parties to guarantee unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance in both government and non-government controlled areas in line with humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law. We further commend the efforts of humanitarian agencies in Ukraine and welcome the 2022 Humanitarian Response Plan to save lives, ensure access to basic services, and strengthen the protection of those affected by the conflict and COVID-19. Finally, Mr. President, let me conclude by stressing Ghana's support for the renewal of the spirit of the Minsk Agreement. We urge the parties to work in good faith and with flexibility to make necessary concessions for an enduring peace in Ukraine with beneficial outcomes for the rest of Europe and indeed globally. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Благодарю представителя Ганы за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Мексики. Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President.
Agradezco las presentaciones de la
I would
subsecretaria
like to
DiCarlo,
thank Undersecretary
del representante
General
especial
Special
Kinnunen y del
Representative
embajador
Kinnunen
Chevik,
and
y
Ambassador
tomamos
Chevik
nota
for their
de
briefings,
los
and we
comentarios
take
de la
note
señora
of the comments
Montián.
from Madam Montián.
Reconocemos la presencia de
We
distinguidos
recognize the
participantes
presence
de alto
of
nivel en esta
distinguished
sesión
high-level participants
y
in
damos
this
la
meeting,
bienvenida a
and
los
we
representantes de
welcome the
Ucrania y de
representatives
Alemania.
of Ukraine and Germany.
La revisión por parte de este
The review
Consejo
by this Council
del estado que
of the
guardan
current status
los acuerdos
of
de
the
Minsk
Minsk
relativos a las
agreements
regiones de
relating
Luhansk
to
y
the
Donetsk
provinces of Luhansk
en
and Donetsk
Ucrania
in the
Oriental
east of Ukraine
se da en el contexto de
is
fuertes
taking place
tensiones
in a
que han
context of
generado
heightened
una
tensions
gran
which
preocupación
have
en
led
la
to
comunidad
great concern
internacional.
amongst the international
Por
community.
ello, pensamos que es
This is why
urgente,
we
ante
feel
todo,
it's a matter of urgency
mandar
above
una
all
señal
to send
clara,
out a clear,
inequívoca,
unequivocal
de la
signal
voluntad de las
of the
partes
will of the
que
parties
permita
which will make it
revertir la
possible
escalada de
to reverse
tensiones
the escalation of
y ceda
tensions
espacio a la
and open up
negociación
space
política,
for political
una
negotiation,
vía que contemple
a path
tres elementos:
which will include three
distensión,
elements: détente,
diplomacia y
diplomacy,
diálogo.
and dialogue.
Hemos tomado nota con
We
gran
have
interés
taken note with great
del
interest
anuncio
of
sobre
the
el retiro de
announcement with
algunas
regard
tropas
to
de la
the
frontera
withdrawal of
con
some
Ucrania.
troops from the border with Ukraine.
Concretarlo a la brevedad
Completing this step as soon as
generará
possible
la
will
confianza
generate the
que
trust
solo dan los
which
hechos
is only
y que
conveyed
las
through
circunstancias
action
reclaman.
and which the
En
circumstances
tanto que la
demand.
única solución real
And since the
es
only
una
genuine
solución
solution is
diplomática,
a diplomatic solution,
damos la bienvenida a la
we
disposición
welcome
que
the
han mostrado
willingness that has
los
been
distintos
displayed
actores
by the various
por
stakeholders
continuar por la vía
to
del diálogo.
continue on the path of
México
dialogue.
reconoce
Mexico
y agradece los
recognizes
esfuerzos
and
de
is
los líderes
grateful for the
mundiales
efforts of
que,
world
siendo
leaders
factores de
who,
influencia,
having
se
influence
han
which they can
involucrado
bring to bear,
personalmente
have
para
personally
tratar de
become
encontrar
involved
una
in order
salida
to try to
pacífica
find a
a
peaceful
esta crisis
exit to this
que sea
crisis,
capaz de
which is
atender
able to
las diversas
address the
preocupaciones de
various
seguridad
security
en la región.
concerns in the region.
Cualquier solución
Any
implica poner fin a las
solution will mean
tensiones
putting
en
an
el
end
este de
to
Ucrania.
tensions in the east of Ukraine.
A 8 años del
8
inicio del
years
conflicto, los
into
acuerdos de
the
Minsk
conflict,
son
the Minsk
el marco para
agreements
alcanzar
are still the
una
framework for
solución
achieving
negociada.
a negotiated
El
solution.
grupo trilateral
The
de contacto
trilateral
y el
contact group
formato
and
de
the
Normandía
Normandy format
ofrecen
offer
esa posibilidad.
this possibility.
Como hemos escuchado,
As we have heard,
el conflicto
the
en Ucrania
conflict in the
Oriental ha
east of
tenido un grave
Ukraine
impacto en la
has had a
población
serious
civil.
impact on the civilian
Se
population.
estima que cerca
It
de
is
3
estimated
millones de
that
personas
almost
requieren
3
de
million
asistencia
people require
humanitaria,
humanitarian assistance,
mientras que alrededor
whilst
de
approximately
1,5 millones de personas se
1.5
encuentran
million
desplazadas.
people are displaced.
La población también
The
enfrenta
population
restricciones
is
en
also
su libertad de
facing
movimiento,
restrictions on their
lo
freedom
cual
of movement,
limita el
which
acceso a los
limits
servicios de
access
salud
to
y de
health and
educación.
education services.
México pide que se
Mexico
garantice la
asks
libertad de
that the
movimiento de
freedom
los
of movement
civiles
for civilians
en
be
ambos lados
guaranteed on
de
both
la línea de
sides
contacto.
of the contact line.
Hacemos un llamado también a las
And we
partes a
also call upon the
facilitar el
parties
acceso
to
humanitario en la
facilitate
zona
humanitarian
de
access
manera
to the area
segura e
in a
irrestricta,
secure and
así como
unrestricted manner,
garantizar el
as
libre
well as to
movimiento
guarantee the
a la
free
misión de
movement of
observación
the special
de la
monitoring
Organización
mission
para la
of the
Seguridad y la
Organization
Cooperación
for
Europea, lo cual es
Security
esencial para la cabal
in
ejecución
Europe.
de
This
su
is
mandato.
essential for the comprehensive
También
implementation of
es
its
necesario
mandate.
destacar
We
que
also
las
would like to
minas,
highlight that
las
mines,
municiones no detonadas
undetonated
y otros
munitions, and
artefactos
other
explosivos
explosive artifacts
son una amenaza
are a
real
real
y
threat
afectan
and
sobremanera a la
disproportionately
población civil.
affect the civilian population.
Exhortamos a las partes a
We call
eliminar
upon the
las
parties
minas
to
existentes y a
eliminate
no
existing
incurrir
mines
en la
and not to
colocación de
proceed
nuevos
to
explosivos.
place
Señor
new
presidente,
explosives.
México
Mr. President,
reitera su
Mexico
compromiso
reiterates its
con
commitment
el respeto
to
a la
for the
soberanía,
respect of the
la
sovereignty,
independencia política
political
y
independence,
la integridad
and the
territorial de
territorial
Ucrania
integrity of Ukraine
dentro de sus
within
fronteras
its
reconocidas
internationally
internacionalmente
recognized borders,
de conformidad
in
con la
accordance
Carta de
with
las
the
Naciones
United
Unidas,
Nations
el derecho internacional
Charter,
y las
international
resoluciones pertinentes de las Naciones Unidas.
Concluyo
resaltando que las tensiones alrededor de la situación en Ucrania y sus potenciales consecuencias hacen evidente lo que tan claramente se ha señalado de
the
distintas
situation very
maneras.
clear, as the Secretary General
Reemplazar
has
la diplomacia
stated.
por la confrontación
Replacing
implicaría
diplomacy by
dar
confrontation
un gran
would be
salto al
to
vacío.
take a dive
Es
over a
hora de
cliff.
refrendar
The
los
time has
esfuerzos
come
en un
to
solo camino,
endorse
el de la
efforts channeled in
distensión,
one single
la
direction,
diplomacia y
détente,
el diálogo.
diplomacy
Gracias,
and
presidente.
dialogue. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Мексики за сделанное заявление. Теперь предоставляю слово представителю Китая.
I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank you for presiding over today's meeting. My thanks also go to USG Rosemary DiCarlo, Ambassador Mikko Kinnunen, Special Representative of the OSCE Chairperson in office, and Ambassador Khalid Shevik, Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, for their briefings. I also listened carefully to the remarks made by Ms. Tatiana Mountain. February 12th this year marked the 7th anniversary of the new Minsk agreements. Consideration of the implementation of the new Minsk agreements is the subject of this council meeting. Universally recognized, the agreements is a fundamental and binding political document for the settlement of the Ukraine issue, and was unanimously endorsed by the Security Council in its resolution 2202. Therefore, it deserves complete and effective implementation by all the parties concerned. Regrettably, however, to date, the majority of the agreement's provisions have yet to be truly implemented. New ceasefire violations have occurred on the line of contact. China believes that the effort to resolve the Ukraine issue must, after all, go back to the starting point, that is, the implementation of the new Minsk agreements. We hope that all parties concerned will take a constructive posture, resolve through dialogue and consultation whatever differences that may arise in the implementation of the agreements, and draw up a roadmap and timetable to implement the agreements to the letter without delay, so as to pave the way for a political solution to the Ukraine crisis. Mr. President, as to the tensions on the eastern frontier of Ukraine, China believes that in the current context, all parties concerned should let reason prevail, adhere to the overarching goal of a political solution, and refrain from any act that may provoke tensions or embellish the discourse about the crisis. The parties should fully consider each other's legitimate security concerns and show mutual respect, and on such a basis, properly resolve their differences through equal-footed consultations. China supports all efforts conducive to easing the tensions and notes the Russian Federation's recent diplomatic engagement with France, Germany, and other European countries at the leadership level. A negotiated, balanced, effective and sustainable European security mechanism will provide a solid foundation for lasting peace and stability across Europe. We trust that European countries will take independent and strategic decisions in line with their own interests. In his most recent public appeal, Secretary General Guterres said, quote, "There is no alternative to diplomacy. All issues, including the most intractable, can and must be addressed and resolved through diplomatic frameworks." End quote. We support the SG's good offices aimed at reducing tensions. We also subscribe to the SG's views. Mr. President, everything happens for a reason. NATO's enlargement is an issue that cannot be bypassed when dealing with the current tensions related to the Ukraine issue. NATO's continuous expansion in the wake of the Cold War runs counter to the trend of our times, that is, to maintain common security. One country's security cannot be obtained at the expense of another country's security. By the same token,
regional security cannot be guaranteed through muscling up or even expanding a military bloc. This applies as much to the European region as to other regions of the world. There is one country that refuses to renounce its Cold War mentality. It says one thing and does another. In order to seek absolute military superiority, it has been planning up in the Asia-Pacific region, creating some trilateral and quadrilateral small circles or cliques bent on provoking confrontation. What it is doing would only throw the Asia-Pacific into division and turmoil and seriously threaten the region's peace and stability to the detriment of the countries in the region, while gaining nothing for itself either. China urges the countries concerned to learn from history, subscribe to the notion of common, comprehensive, cooperative and sustainable security, adhere to the approach of enhancing mutual trust and settling disputes through dialogue and consultation, and do more to contribute to world peace and regional stability. I thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Китая за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Албании.
Mr. President, I thank the USG DiCarlo, Ambassadors Kinnunen and Cevic for their briefing. We welcome the high-level participation in this meeting. Let me first express our gratitude to the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, which continues to work in a volatile and unpredictable environment, and as we heard from Ambassador Cevic, under multiple challenges and restrictions. We must continue to support the women and men of the monitoring mission, their tireless efforts in contributing to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability and security, and to monitoring and supporting the implementations of all OSCE principles and commitments throughout Ukraine. Mr. President, Albania supports the implementation of the Minsk Agreement. We reject any pressure on Ukraine to implement Minsk Agreement according to one-side interpretation. Albania expresses its full support for the rights of minorities in Ukraine and anywhere else. Minorities should enjoy their rights and participate actively in the social and political life of the country where they live. This must be part of overall commitments to equally serving all the population and building an inclusive and democratic society. Yet, as we have seen more than once, problems start when minorities are intentionally instrumentalized to create dysfunctional states. Asking for executive powers for Russian minorities in Ukraine means nothing less than taking control of the decision-making power in Kiev to dictate foreign, security and defense policies and undermine democratic processes. We should not accept such policy of fabricating dysfunctional states, not in Ukraine, not anywhere else. In this very context, we are deeply concerned by the Russian parliament call for the recognition of independence and sovereignty of parts of the territory of Ukraine. Here we are with the stereotype playbook that we have seen in Georgia in 2008. If taken, such decisions would have no legal validity. They are against international law, they are against UN Charter. They run totally against the substance of the Minsk agreements. Mr. President, we continue to be alarmed by the very large-scale, unprovoked and unjustified Russian military build-up in and around Ukraine and in Belarus. The much-claimed withdrawal of some of the troops stationed there is not verified, and credible reports indicate the contrary. A further reinforcement with active combat troops and weapons, which reportedly now number 150,000. This continued and reinforcing military surrounding is a Damocles sword over the government and people of Ukraine. It instigates fear to the population. It frightens the domestic and foreign investors and seeks to bring the economy into collapse and the country to its knees. The decision to partially block the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait under the pretext of holding regular naval exercises only adds to this strangulation effort. Further, the most recent reports of heavy shelling from the occupied territory in Donbass
only reinforce the worries about the pretext to start executing a long and carefully designed scenario. In this context, let me reiterate our firm position in support of the sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We demand the removal of the occupying troops from the occupied territory. We condemn the illegal annexation of Crimea and its military support to the separatist forces in the country. Albania remains committed to the fundamental principles underpinning European security, including that each nation has the right to choose its own security arrangements. Any renewed attack on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine would be a clear and further breach of international law, would severely affect European security, and should be met with outright and vigorous condemnation. We call on this Council and on the international community not to let Ukraine down, not to accept policies and actions that threaten the existence of a sovereign nation. Mr. President, despite everything indicating acceleration of escalation, we will continue to emphasize the value and the importance of diplomacy and dialogue in reaching a peaceful solution in the conflict in eastern Ukraine and dealing with Russian concerns. Russia should take the offer to engage in a renewed European security dialogue initiated by Poland as the current OSCE chair. We support the call of Secretary Blinken for talks with Minister Lavrov as soon as possible and renewed NATO-Russia Council meetings. Every mechanism must be used and fully exploited for diplomacy and de-escalation. Finally, we welcome the calls of the Secretary General to defuse tension and to de-escalate actions on the ground. We would support the intensification of these efforts and the availability of his good offices in the search of a peaceful solution. I thank you.
Я благодарю за сделанное заявление представителя Албании и предоставляю слово представителю Франции.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie la secrétaire générale adjointe pour les affaires politiques, le représentant spécial de la présidence en exercice de l'OSCE en Ukraine et le chef de la mission spéciale d'observation de l'OSCE en Ukraine pour leur présentation. La mise en œuvre des accords de Minsk ne saurait être considérée de manière indépendante de la situation aux frontières de l'Ukraine où les tensions ont atteint ces derniers jours un niveau sans précédent en raison du renforcement de l'activité militaire russe. La France a mené des efforts continus avec ses partenaires au cours des dernières semaines pour la désescalade et le dialogue. Notre position est fondée sur deux piliers. Premièrement, l'accumulation de capacités militaires considérables à la frontière d'un État voisin constitue un comportement menaçant et inacceptable, et ce, d'autant plus que la Russie a déjà porté atteinte à la souveraineté et à l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine dans le passé. Toute nouvelle agression aurait des conséquences massives et un coût sévère pour la Russie. Les Européens sont unis et ils sont prêts à agir en coordination avec tous leurs partenaires à ce sujet. Deuxièmement, la France est convaincue que la désescalade est possible par le dialogue et par la diplomatie. C'est le sens des efforts menés par le président Macron en coordination avec le chancelier allemand. Nous sommes prêts à engager ce dialogue. Non seulement s'agissant du conflit dans le Donbass, c'est le travail que nous menons au sein du format Normandie, mais également sur les questions de sécurité et de stabilité en Europe, dans le respect des principes fondamentaux établis par la Charte des Nations Unies et dans les documents fondateurs de l'OSCE, que sont l'acte final d'Helsinki et la Charte de Paris pour une nouvelle Europe. À cet égard, nous soutenons pleinement le processus lancé par la présidence polonaise de l'OSCE en vue d'un dialogue renouvelé sur la sécurité européenne. Je souhaite maintenant revenir à la mise en œuvre des accords de Minsk qui mobilisent la France et l'Allemagne depuis 2015. Les efforts se sont poursuivis au cours des dernières semaines au sein du format Normandie. La réunion de Paris le 26 janvier a permis d'exprimer à nouveau le soutien de toutes les parties au respect inconditionnel du cessez-le-feu. Il convient d'aller plus loin, ce qui n'a malheureusement pas été possible lors de la réunion du 10 février, et d'enregistrer enfin des progrès concrets dans la mise en œuvre du paquet de mesures de Minsk dans toutes ses dimensions, c'est-à-dire sécuritaire, humanitaire et politique. La France a la ferme conviction que les accords de Minsk constituent le cadre adapté à la poursuite du dialogue et qu'ils laissent l'espace nécessaire à la définition de solutions concrètes mutuellement acceptables, notamment au sein du groupe de contact trilatéral. Nous appelons les parties à s'abstenir de toute déclaration ou mesure allant à l'encontre de la mise en œuvre de ces accords. Nous exprimons à ce titre notre préoccupation au sujet de l'adoption par la Douma d'État de la Fédération de Russie d'une résolution appelant à reconnaître les territoires séparatistes d'Ukraine. Si elle venait à être promulguée, cette résolution constituerait une violation assumée de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine par la Russie et une remise en cause fondamentale des accords de Minsk. Nous saluons également le rôle de la mission spéciale d'observation de l'OSCE en Ukraine, qui joue un rôle essentiel dans les efforts de désescalade. Elle est les yeux et les oreilles de la communauté internationale. La France, tout comme l'Allemagne, maintiendra ses ressortissants déployés sur le terrain afin que la mission reste opérationnelle pendant cette période critique. Nous avons pris note des informations de l'OSCE au sujet de possibles violations du cessez-le-feu au cours des dernières heures. Nous souhaitons que de manière systématique, la mission spéciale puisse établir les faits de manière impartiale. Monsieur le Président, la défense des principes de la Charte des Nations Unies, en particulier le respect de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale des États, ainsi que le règlement pacifique des différends, doit être l'objectif partagé de l'ensemble des membres de ce Conseil. La France continuera à se mobiliser en ce sens, ainsi que pour la construction d'une paix juste et durable et pour le rétablissement de la pleine souveraineté ukrainienne sur certaines régions de Donetsk et Luhansk. Je vous remercie.
Я благодарю представителя Франции за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Габона.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Je voudrais remercier la secrétaire générale adjointe, Madame Rosemary DiCarlo, pour son exposé. Je remercie également le représentant spécial Mikko Kinnunen et le chef de la mission d'observation de l'OSCE, Yashar Alit-Chevik, pour leurs exposés. Je salue également la présence parmi nous de Madame Tetiana Montian. Monsieur le Président, mon pays continue de suivre avec beaucoup d'attention la situation qui prévaut aux frontières de la Russie et de l'Ukraine. Nous entendons les craintes et les appels alarmants de ceux qui redoutent une action militaire imminente. Nous notons surtout avec intérêt la volonté exprimée par les parties prenantes de maintenir les canaux politiques et diplomatiques ouverts, ainsi que les différents appels à éviter l'escalade. Parallèlement à la rhétorique d'alarme et aux manœuvres d'exhibition de force, les 10 derniers jours ont été particulièrement marqués par une intense activité sur le front diplomatique qui s'est traduite par des initiatives européennes et américaines avec pour objectif d'ensemencer rehausser les sillons du dialogue et éviter l'irréparable. L'annonce récente de la Russie de retirer une partie de ses troupes en faction à ses frontières augure sans doute d'une volonté de désescalade qui s'inscrit en addition aux assurances répétées de la Russie de n'avoir aucune intention belliqueuse. Cela devrait participer de manière significative à baisser le niveau de tension et à régénérer le fil de la confiance indispensable à la conduite d'une diplomatie préventive. Dans le même élan, mon pays retient de l'adresse récente du président des États-Unis d'Amérique la volonté de privilégier le dialogue ainsi que le refus d'un affrontement qui aurait des conséquences désastreuses pour tous. Monsieur le Président, la situation n'est certainement pas simple, mais c'est justement parce qu'elle ne l'est pas qu'elle mérite d'être abordée dans la sérénité et avec le plus grand sens de responsabilité. C'est dans cet objectif que nous voulons réitérer notre appel à l'ensemble des parties prenantes à la retenue et à privilégier les voies du dialogue et la négociation en vue de préserver la stabilité et la paix dans la région. Nous encourageons toutes les initiatives qui sont menées en faveur de la désescalade et de la reprise du dialogue et appelons les parties prenantes à tirer avantage des canaux diplomatiques existants pour amorcer la décrispation. À cet effet, le format de Normandie et les accords de Minsk constituent des cadres de référence. Les accords de Minsk plante le décor d'une issue pacifique globale aux principales prétentions des partis. Et c'est sûrement en cela qu'elles ont été entérinées par les Nations Unies. La mise en œuvre de ces accords est cruciale, notamment pour parvenir à une trêve des hostilités, à la restauration des frontières de l'Ukraine et à une meilleure réponse humanitaire, tout en ouvrant la voie à une pacification durable des relations de voisinage et éventuellement à la promotion d'une reprise des relations économiques. Mon pays invite les parties à respecter les engagements souscrits, à capitaliser le socle d'acquis et à renouer le dialogue. L'appel au dialogue du secrétaire d'État américain Anthony Blinken est à cet égard une initiative dans la bonne direction. Bien entendu, mon pays demeure fermement attaché au respect de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de chaque État. Ces principes cardinaux, consacrés par la Charte des Nations Unies et l'acte constitutif de l'Union africaine, sont le ciment de notre contrat social en tant que membre de la communauté internationale. Pour conclure, je voudrais, au nom de mon pays, appeler ce Conseil à être plus que jamais mobilisé pour endiguer le spectre de la peur et repousser toute logique de confrontation. C'est l'une des vocations de ce Conseil. Et l'efficacité des outils de paix dont nous disposons est garantie lorsque nous faisons preuve d'unité et de responsabilité. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Я благодарю представителя Габона за сделанное заявление. Сейчас я сделаю дополнительное заявление в своем качестве уже заместителя министра иностранных дел Российской Федерации. Я внимательно выслушал сегодняшнюю дискуссию, выступления коллег. Хотел бы остановиться на некоторых вопросах, которые были затронуты. Во-первых, хочу обратить внимание на ненужную спекуляцию в отношении обращения депутатов Госдумы России к президенту Путину с просьбой признания Донбасса. И скажу главное. Речь идет о предложении рассмотреть этот вопрос. Хотя сама его постановка отражает настроение в российском Донбассе, население которого в Донбассе на протяжении 7 лет подвергается обстрелам со стороны украинской армии. Мы сегодня об этом говорили. Не стоит также забывать, что сотни тысяч жителей этого украинского региона имеют российское гражданство. Наверное, другого выбора у них не было после того, как Украина прекратила выполнение своих социальных обязательств Однако еще раз подчеркну, что речь идет об инициативе депутатов Госдумы России.
So what we need to do is concentrate on the implementation of the Minsk agreements, and many have said so today, rather than speculate about this. it is also equally important to make sure that we avoid discussing these issues within the Security Council. Otherwise, we will be discussing any decision of any parliament in the world here. Let me draw your attention to another thing that was said by President Putin. He said that we need to do utmost to make sure that the solution to Donbass should be found through the implementation of the Minsk agreement. Mr. cleverly talked about the background, the prehistory to the issue today, and I don't think that the picture he painted was the correct one. It was one-sided and superficial. Let me just recall one historic period which preceded an issue, namely an illegal and bloody coup d'etat in Kiev in 2014. The radicals and nationalists came into power then. They refused to have a dialogue with the Russian-speaking people. They threatened them. The Russian language is being discriminated and continues to be discriminated against. Versions of history are being put forward which include even the glorification of Nazi criminals. This is something that happened and continues. And this led to the separation of the Crimea and reunification with Russia as a result of a referendum. So the conflict now is something that has to have a clear picture which is a reflection of a real situation. Now, as regards to the alleged prepared aggression of Russia against Ukraine, well, some people are very usefully, in inverted commas, put forward the military scenarios, and this was done by the Secretary of State of the United States, and he listed the provocations that could be used as a pretext to invade Ukraine, and this is regrettable. I would even go so far as to say that they are dangerous because they bring in more tension into the already tense atmosphere, but these are words and statements. We made a large number of statements of various levels which underscore what it is that we propose, that we intend to do. And it's very unfortunate that those statements at the highest level that came out of Moscow were not heeded. But those are statements. So what do we have on the plane of actual facts? The fact is that the Russian forces were in the Russian territory and remain on the Russian territory. And the day before yesterday, some of the units, after their exercises, were returning to their home bases in Russia. And the Russian officials have been saying, I am saying that my country is conducting drills in our own territory in the regime that we deem needed. Also, there are some other facts that I would like to draw your attention to. Facts in addition to words. Ukraine is violating the Vienna document of 2011 on confidence-building measures. On the Ukrainian side, there is 122,000 troops. The United States last year provided weapons to Ukraine to the amount of $650 million. That is a lot. In January, $200 million worth of dollars of weaponry was provided, and we are not even talking about what's being provided by UK, Canada, and the Baltic states. All of these states are sending lethal weaponry to Kiev, attack aircraft, multiple rocket launchers, Stingers, Javelins, rifles, ammunition for them. Poland is providing ammunition for 122, 125 millimeter weapons, which are banned under the Minsk agreements, as we know. So this information aggression, constant statements about the Russian aggression, why they need it, in order to be able to supply all of these things under the pretext of the Russian aggression. So what we see here is obvious, is the desire to bog down the discussion about the legal obligations.
as regards the situation. We are ready for a dialogue, for a very serious dialogue, not imitation dialogue, but a real one. Today, as you know, the U.S. ambassador in Moscow received our reaction on the issue of your security guarantees, and we do hope that this will be very carefully looked at in Washington, because it's a very detailed and written document. Thank you. For that, I am resuming my function as President of the Council. And the representative of the United States has asked for the floor for a further statement. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I had hoped that what we would hear in response from our Russian colleague, a response to Secretary Blinken's call for Russia to announce today without equivocation that they do not plan to invade Ukraine, but instead it was a continuation of the disinformation and the rhetoric that we continue to hear and we've heard before. The Secretary of State laid out the facts. He laid out the facts that we see on the ground and that all of you are seeing on the ground very clearly. And what we all see is escalation, including the decision by the Russian Duma to call for recognition of a separatist movement in total disdain for the Minsk agreement. And hopefully, as you stated, this will not go. It will not go any further. But let me just say clearly for this room, for all of you who called for diplomacy, we will continue to intensify. We will continue to escalate our diplomatic efforts. And we call for Russia to cease confrontation and accept our invitation to dialogue. We will look forward to engaging at the negotiating table to discuss the response that the Russians sent to us just this morning. And I will end by saying what Secretary Blinken said today. He did not come here to promote war, but he came here to prevent war and to find a way to a peaceful solution. Thank you.
Я благодарен представителю США за сделанное заявление. Сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Украины.
To the representative of Ukraine.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, all protocols observed. On this day 7 years ago, the Ukrainian city of Debaltseve sustained a full-fledged offensive by the Russian regular troops and their proxies. Heavy artillery and rocket shellings did not spare neither Ukrainian military nor civilians. All this happened despite the disengagement line agreed by Ukraine and Russia under the Minsk Memorandum of 19th September 2014. The second document in the set of the Minsk agreements, which clearly defined the Debaltseve is a government-controlled area. This happened despite the Minsk package of measures was signed a week earlier, and its first provision contained commitment to comprehensive ceasefire. This is just one example of how Russia violated the agreements almost immediately after signing them. So far, disrespect to undertaking commitments remains a hallmark of Russia's strategy. Only this morning, the Ukrainian Stanitsa Luganska was shelled with heavy weapons from occupied territory of Donbas. Civilian infrastructure damaged, including a daycare center. Upon the instructions of my government, I have to bring to the attention of the Security Council another outrageous situation that undermines the Minsk agreements and the entire process of peaceful settlement. 2 days ago, the Russian Duma appealed to the Russian president to recognize the occupied parts of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine as so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. This decision runs counter the commitments undertaken by Russia as a signatory of the Minsk agreements. Therefore, I requested the Security Council in my letter to the Security Council dated 16 February 2022 to consider this situation today. Our standpoint remains unchanged. Russia's recognition of the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics will be tantamount to its deliberate withdrawal from the Minsk agreements. Such a move will cause a serious blow to the political diplomatic settlements that Ukraine and its partners have been actively engaged to promote. Recognition of the so-called republics will have no legal implications. Russia will not succeed at masking the Russian occupation administrations in the temporarily occupied territories of Lugansk and Donetsk regions as independent entities, or to disguise its own involvement as a party to the armed conflict in Donbass. Instead, if the Russian president endorses the ruling of the State Duma, it will have much broader, destructive consequences for the international rules-based order and the global security architecture. Therefore, Russia has a choice to embark on the path of de-escalation and diplomatic dialogue, or experience decisive, consolidated response by the international community. It is a matter of practical concern that the same pattern was implemented and the same language was used in 2008, despite what the Deputy Minister just said, referring that it is just an appeal of Duma. In 2008, the appeal by the State Duma of the Russian Federation to the Russian President Medvedev on the need to recognize the Republic of South Ossetia and the Republic of Abkhazia preceded the presidential decree on such recognition adopted on 26th of August 2008. So just don't call it a mere appeal by Duma. I thank the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, for his powerful statement of February 16 on the issue of Duma's decision, as well as I thank the Foreign Minister Le Drian of France for his clear statement, as well as I thank Minister Cleverly of the UK for his statement today, as well as I thank Norway, Ireland, Albania, and many other partners and responsible members of the international community for their statements on this issue. And I would like to ask the Secretariat of the Security Council to make my letter part of the proceedings. Letter dated February 16. It is important, however, as well, because the soft and feeble reaction of the UN in 2008 resulted in lasting occupation of parts of the Georgian territory. And I will not quote what the then Secretary Ban Ki-moon said and what the PGA said at that moment. We hope that the UN leadership today learned the lessons from the occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and we all, both members and the states and the Secretariat, will be more vocal on defending the UN Charter. I addressed my letter on the issue to the Secretary General, and I wait for a meaningful reply by the Secretary General to my letter. We call on Russia to take a constructive stance towards achieving progress in the framework of the existing negotiations formats. Otherwise, Russia will bear full responsibility for ruining the Minsk agreements and the process of peaceful settlement of the armed conflict. The Minsk agreements are the complex of 3 documents, and we should approach its implementation from this standpoint. Starting from the Minsk Protocol of 5 of September 2014, let me remind you that according to the paragraph 4 of this document, Ukraine and Russia agreed on establishment of security zones in the border areas of Ukraine and Russia with the OSCE permanent monitoring and verification on the border. Ukraine expects Russia to deliver on this agreed commitment, which would become a major input into the resolution efforts. It is more than urgent now, as about 150,000 Russian troops have been deployed in the vicinity of the Ukraine's borders. We note the statements by the Russian officials on their withdrawal, although verification and credible proofs are required. Unusual military activities on Ukraine's borders that Russia denied to explain in violation of the Vienna document on confidence and security building measures have a detrimental economic and social impact on Ukraine already, regardless of ultimate plans by Russia. The military buildup on the ground has been coupled with a blockade by Russia of the large parts of the Black Sea under the pretext of naval exercises. This has made navigation and international shipping extremely complicated, causing serious challenges for the major Ukrainian ports. All these actions feed into the concept of the hybrid war against Ukraine, with disinformation and cyber attacks as its other important components. For instance, the most recently, Russia pulled another propaganda ace up its sleeve, blaming Ukraine for genocide in the occupied territories. These are fake and irresponsible allegations by Russia aimed at hiding its responsibility for the occupation of the Ukrainian territories and subsequent human rights violations there. Excellencies, Ukraine remains committed to peaceful resolution of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict by political diplomatic means. Ukraine wants peace, security, and stability, not only for itself, but also for the entire Europe. At the same time, I reiterate that in the event of Russia opting for escalation, Ukraine will defend itself. We welcome all diplomatic and other efforts taken at different levels to prevent the worst-case scenario. We are grateful for support and solidarity with Ukraine so explicitly demonstrated worldwide. We reiterate the need to further explore all political means to ensure the escalation. Reinvigorating the Normandy format and the trilateral countergroup is one of the necessary steps. Both include Russia and Ukraine as parties to the conflict and constitute the proper framework for their direct dialogue. The dialogue that Russia still avoids and hides behind their puppet occupation administrations. As long as Russia makes preconditions about direct dialogue between Ukraine and Moscow's proxies, which are effectively a non-starter, the progress on the implementation of the Minsk agreements will remain elusive. Hence, it was important that political advisors met in Paris and Berlin. Despite many divergences on implementation, the Minsk agreements persist. We are ready to resume the N4 talks in all formats, including at the level of the leaders. We regret that Russia remains unwilling to hold N4 summit. The last time our leaders met in Paris in December 2019, the decisions adopted then remain unimplemented by Russia, despite Ukraine regularly put forward concrete initiatives on ceasefire, humanitarian demining, withdrawal of troops and hardware, mutual release of detained persons. opening new entry-exit points, ensuring unimpeded access of the OSCE SMM throughout the conflict-affected area, as well as implementation of the political provisions of the Minsk agreements. On 22 December last year, we managed to find a common understanding on resuming the ceasefire regime, initially launched in July 2020. We offered far-reaching compromises to strike the deal, but ceasefire violations by the Russian occupation forces have not yet halted. Restrictions of the SMM freedom of movement continue to be a major impediment for the implementation in full of the SMM mandate. During the last meeting of the TCG on February 9, Chief Monitor Chevik provided statistical information confirming that 90% of restrictions of the freedom of movement of SMM patrols occur in the temporarily occupied territories of Donbass. We call on Russia to ensure unfettered access of the SMM throughout the entire territory under its effective control, in particular in the border areas. This is practically important against the backdrop of Russia's decision not to extend the mandate of the OSCE border observer mission at the Russian checkpoint Gukova and Donetsk, shut down last September. In this regard, we support the initiative by France and Germany to establish a coordination and verification mechanism for the OSCE SMM. On the political track, discussions on such issues as implementation of the so-called Steinmeier formula, the special order of local self-government is in certain areas of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, amnesty law, modalities of local elections so far continue to be blocked by the Russian side. The Russian representatives simply refused to continue discussions on the working proposals submitted by the Ukrainian delegation back in June 2020, relating to the special order of the local self-government in certain areas in Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine, and other issues on the agenda of the political working group. Ukraine has taken steps on implementation of agreed provisions relating to the political process. In particular, we submit for consideration by the trilateral countergroup initial proposals to the law on special order of local self-government in certain areas of Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine. According to ODIHR standards, resumption of control of the border should be a prerequisite for holding local elections in Donbass. Otherwise, it would be impossible to create the necessary security environment for holding the democratic elections in line with the OSCE standards. Excellencies, it remains up to Russia to take decisions that would lead to full implementation of the commitments it has undertaken under the Minsk agreements, signed by President Putin's ambassador to Ukraine, Zurabov, in blue ink. On September 5, 2014, Mr. Zurabov signed the agreement. On September 19, Mr. Zurabov, ambassador of Putin, signed the agreement. On February 12, 2015, ambassador of Putin signed the agreement. Drawing lessons from the past, we urge Russia to abandon its long-lasting strategy on Ukraine, based on threat and use of force against the territorial integrity of Ukraine, based on fundamental principles of peaceful relations enshrined in the UN Charter. But before I end, let me address Sergei Vasilyevich по-русски. На днях средства массовой информации распространили текст, который приписывается вашей коллеге по цеху, госпоже Захаровой. Позвольте зацитировать. С точки зрения международного права, Геополитические преобразования 1991 года
Geopolitical
не привели к
transformations of
исчезновению СССР
1991 did not result in the
как
disappearance
субъекта
of the
международного права.
Soviet Union as a subject of international law.
Государство
The
под названием
state,
СССР
which was called the USSR,
не прекратило,
did not
а продолжило свою международную правосубъектность.
rather continued
Конец цитаты.
its existence under
Каково
international
оно,
law.
Сергей
End of
Васильевич,
quote.
в кресле
So,
постоянного члена
I
Совета
wonder
Безопасности Союза Советских Социалистических Республик?
how
Ведь так
do you
указывает
feel
действующая
in Security
редакция
Council as
Статута
a
ООН, что это
representative
место Советского Союза.
of the USSR?
Когда я
That
читаю
would seem to be
подобные тексты,
what
когда я
the
слушаю
document now says.
товарищ Мунтян,
When I hear such text and when I
я хочу
listen
повторить
to
те
Comrade
же самые
Montan,
слова,
I want to
которые я
repeat
произнес
the
на таком же
same
точно
words
заседании
I said
по
at
вопросу исполнения Минских
the
соглашений
exact same meeting on the
18
Minsk Agreement's
февраля
implementation on the 18th of
2020
February
года.
2020.
Собственно говоря, это слова
These
известного российского поэта
words of a
Евтушенко
very famous Russian poet,
1962 года.
Yevtushenko, they were said in 1962.
Поэт Евтушенко сказал:
And the poet Yevtushenko
«Пусть
then
мне говорят,
said, let
успокойся,
them tell me to calm down.
спокойным я быть не сумею,
I will not stay calm
покуда наследники
as
Сталина
long
живы
as the inheritors of
еще
Stalin
на земле.
are still alive and
Мне будет казаться,
walking the
что
earth.
Сталин
It would
еще в
continue
мавзолее».
seeming to me that Stalin is
Сергей
still
Васильевич, на
in a
дворе
mausoleum.
21 век.
Sergei Vasilievich, we
Давайте-ка
are in the
вернемся к
21st
статуту ООН,
century.
к уставу ООН.
Let's get back to
Давайте-ка
the
начнем
UN
его
Charter
исполнять.
and let's start
Изменим
implementing
статью
this
23,
charter. Let's change Article
исполним
23.
статью 2,
Let's
4,
implement Article 22,
108.
24, and 108.
Спасибо за внимание.
I thank you for your attention.
Я благодарю
I thank
представителя Украины за сделанное заявление
Ukraine for his
и
statement.
предоставляю
And
слово
I'll give the floor
представителю
to
Германии.
the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany is grateful for the opportunity to speak in today's session. We would like to thank you, Under-Secretary General Di Carlo, the Special Representative of the OSCE, Chairperson in office in Ukraine and in the Trilateral Contact Group, and the head of the OSCE's Special Monitoring Mission. Together with France, Germany stays committed to achieving progress in the Normandy format, which plays a central role in advancing the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Many obstacles remain. However, the reaffirmed ceasefire of July 2020 proved that progress can be made if political will is there. With regard to recent reports on increased shellings in eastern Ukraine, we recall that the agreement must be observed, and it is utterly unacceptable that to attack civilian infrastructure. On 26th of January in Paris and on 10th February in Berlin, talks were held. All participants committed themselves to the full implementation of the Minsk agreements and to continuing talks in the N4 and in the Trilateral Contact Group format. In this respect, we expressed our strong concern about the resolution of the Russian State Duma calling on the President of the Russian Federation to recognize the self-declared People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent states. This would run counter to the Minsk agreements and constitute a further breach of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, in this tense situation, it is very important to establish facts and to identify disinformation. We commend the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission's indispensable role in establishing facts on the security situation. We must ensure that it can carry out its full mandate without interruption throughout Ukraine. This is why we leave the German, and France does the same, and other partners, seconded staff on the ground. This is also why we are deeply concerned about the restrictions of SMM monitors' freedom of movement and destruction of their equipment. Mr. President, in these days we cannot evaluate the state of the Minsk agreements without factoring in military developments in the region. In recent months, an unprecedented military buildup of Russian forces has taken place on the Russian and Belarusian side of Ukraine's border. It is next to impossible to not perceive this as a threat or the preparation for an attack. We deplore that Russia has so far failed to provide any satisfactory explanation for this course of action. The UN Charter is crystal clear in this respect. It prohibits not only the use of force, but also the mere threat of using force. Germany fully supports the sovereignty, territorial integrity, unity, and independence of Ukraine within its international recognized borders, in line with the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, the Charter of Paris, and all OSCE commitments. In order to diffuse tensions, we have stepped up our diplomatic efforts in close coordination with our French partners. We have taken note of Russia's recent announcement to downsize its troop presence alongside the Ukrainian border, but we call on Russia now to immediately follow up on this announcement and to withdraw its troops from Ukraine's border substantially and verifiably. Russia should be aware that any military aggression against Ukraine would entail severe political, economic, and geostrategic consequences. Moreover, we urge Russia to provide full transparency regarding its military activities. To this end, Russia should make full use of the information and consultation mechanisms provided for by the Vienna document within the OSCE framework. Together with its partners and allies, Germany remains open to discussing with Russia security concerns of mutual interest. Mr. President, if a sovereign member state of this organization adopts an aggressive posture towards another sovereign member state of this organization, this is not something the United Nations and its member states should be casual about. It is good that the UN bodies stay abreast of the situation around Ukraine, and we will have a debate in the General Assembly on 23rd of February. Germany certainly will remain strongly committed to finding a diplomatic solution, and we hope others will too. Thank you.
Я признателен представителю Германии за сделанное заявление. Хочу сейчас сделать дополнительное выступление уже в качестве заместителя министра иностранных дел Российской Федерации. Считать вот что. Здесь сегодня звучали слова «война», «агрессия». Самое интересное, что никто никогда от России, от Москвы, здесь в ООН таких слов не произносит.
Has said those words on behalf of Moscow or Russia.
Or
will say those words.
Мне жаль, что не услышаны очень сильные, серьезные заявления
that very strong, very serious statements made by Mr. Putin in the recent days as regards the situation in Ukraine, in the eastern part of the country, were not heard. I would like our partners to at least hear what was said at the press conference where in Moscow such distinguished representatives visited us as the President of France, as the German Chancellor. There were negotiations there and detailed press conferences where our guests spoke and the President of the Russian Federation. We have a meeting today on the Minsk package of measures, and I am very satisfied with the fact that most of the statements stated that the Minsk agreements are very clear and the only international legal framework, so to settle the inter-Ukrainian conflict. By the way, I have a great deal of respect for our interpreters, how they manage to keep up and speed with what they're saying and to do it correctly. Well, let me then make two requests here. Two statements here. Zelensky called the Minsk agreements totally without merit.
Ну и второе, смысл, видимо, доведен.
Yeah, well, the meaning was conveyed. And the
second statement. I listened very carefully to the statement just made, including the illegal nature of Russian membership at the UN and Security Council. Unfortunately, I have to say that it's not the first time representatives of other countries, including Ukraine, want to self-aggrandize using this argument. And the calculation here is very clear. It's for the benefit of those who are not very well versed in these issues. Well, if we are going to discuss whether or not Russia went through the procedure of becoming a member of the UN, well, we could ask the same question of Ukraine. Maybe Ukraine is also a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Russia is a successor state to the USSR. Ukraine is a new statehood. As regards poems and quoting them, it's a very good thing when a political message is in a poetic form. But I do like poems myself about beauty, for example. It's by poet Zabolotsky, a Russian, a Soviet poet. And the question in the poem is about beauty, whether the beauty is a vessel itself or whether it is the fire that the vessel contains. And I would hope, I hope the interpreters managed with that, but I would compare beauty with wisdom. And we have to make sure that we come up with wise decision when it comes to also the settlement in Ukraine on the basis of the Minsk package of measures. Thank you. I once again resume my function as President of the Security Council. And we do not have any names on the list of speakers anymore, but I would like to put my question to the briefers, our briefers, and ask them whether they would like to make comments. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no further comments to make.
Хорошо, спасибо. Спрашиваю Мика Кинунина, специального представителя действующего председателя ОБСЕ на Украине и в трехсторонней контактной группе.
Thank you, Mr. President. Also, no further comments. However, I would very much like to thank for possibility to participate in this briefing of the UN Security Council today. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Спрашиваю его представительства господина Яшара Халита Чевика, главного наблюдателя специальной мониторинговой миссии ОБСЕ на Украине.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll join my fellow briefers, and thank you. I have no further comments.
И спрашиваю госпожу Татьяну Монтян.
The question is to Ms. Tatiana Montian.
Не слышно то, что вы говорите, к сожалению.
Unfortunately, we cannot hear you.
Нажмите, пожалуйста, микрофон.
Could you press the microphone button, please?
Слышно?
Сейчас да, отлично.
We can hear you now.
Теперь слышно?
Да.
Ага, отлично. Тут мне очень многие люди пишут после моей речи.
Many people have written to me after my speech, and they're saying to me, please tell them that no one is in fear of an imminent Russian invasion, except for those people who have been inflicting violence on Ukraine now 8th year running. Well, they will leave Ukraine clutching
American aircraft. The rest of them will take it in stride, because the collective West, that exactly was the reason behind their coup d'etat and Maidan. That was the game to throw the troops of the current Kiev regime into Donetsk and Luhansk, receive a reaction, and then play a game with sanctions. But we will see who will stand to lose from sanctions more. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Montian, for your statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I thank the interpreters especially. The meeting is adjourned.